Chapter 20 of The American. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American by Henry James. Chapter 20. Valentin de Bellegarde died tranquilly just as the cold, faint March dawn began to illumine the faces of the little knot of friends gathered about his bedside. An hour afterwards Newman left the inn and drove to Geneva. He was naturally unwilling to be present at the arrival of Madame de Bellegarde and her first-born. At Geneva for the moment he remained. He was like a man who has had a fall and wants to sit still and count his bruises. He instantly wrote to Madame de Saintré, relating her the circumstances of her brother's death, with certain exceptions, and asking her what was the earliest moment at which he might hope that she would consent to see him. M. Ledoux had told him that he had reason to know that Valentin's will — Bellegarde had a great deal of elegant personal property to dispose of — contained a request that he should be buried near his father in the churchyard of Fleurières, and Newman intended that the state of his own relations with the family should not deprive him of the satisfaction of helping to pay the last earthly honors to the best fellow in the world. He reflected that Valentin's friendship was older than Urbain's enmity, and that at a funeral it was easy to escape notice. Madame de Saintré's answer to his letter enabled him to time his arrival at Fleurières. This answer was very brief. It ran as follows. I thank you for your letter and for your being with Valentin. It is a most inexpressible sorrow to me that I was not. To see you will be nothing but a distress to me. There is no need, therefore, to wait for what you call brighter days. It is all one now, and I shall have no brighter days. Come when you please, only notify me first. My brother is to be buried here on Friday, and my family is to remain here. C. de C. As soon as he had received this letter, Newman went straight to Paris and to Poitiers. The journey took him far southward, through green Touraine and across the far shining Loire, into a country where the early spring deepened about him as he went. But he had never made a journey during which he heeded less what he would have called the lay of the land. He obtained lodging at the inn at Poitiers, and the next morning drove in a couple of hours to the village of Fleurières. But here, preoccupied though he was, he could not fail to notice the picturesqueness of the place. It was what the French call a petit bourg. It lay at the base of a sort of huge mound on the summit of which stood the crumbling ruins of a feudal castle, much of whose sturdy material, as well as that of the wall which dropped along the hill to enclose the clustered houses defensively, had been absorbed into the very substance of the village. The church was simply the former chapel of the castle, fronting upon its grass-grown court, which, however, was of generous enough width to have given up its quaintest corner to a little graveyard. Here the very headstones themselves seemed to sleep as they slanted into the grass. The patient elbow of the rampart held them together on one side, and in front, far beneath their mossy lids, the green plains and blue distances stretched away. The way to church, up the hill, was impracticable to vehicles. It was lined with peasants, 2 or 3 rows deep, who stood watching old Madame de Bellegarde slowly ascend it, on the arm of her elder son, behind the pall-bearers of the other. Newman chose to lurk among the common mourners, who murmured, Madame la Comtesse, as a tall figure veiled in black passed before them. He stood in the dusky little church while the service was going forward, but at the dismal tombside he turned away and walked down the hill. He went back to Poitiers and spent 2 days in which patience and impatience were singularly commingled. On the 3rd day he sent Madame de Saintré a note saying that he would call upon her in the afternoon, and in accordance with this he again took his way to Fleurières. He left his vehicle at the tavern in the village street and obeyed the simple instructions which were given him for finding the château. "It is just beyond there," said the landlord, and pointed to the tree-tops of the park, above the opposite houses. Newman followed the first cross-road to the right. It was bordered with mouldy cottages, and in a few moments saw before him the peaked roofs of the towers. Advancing farther, he found himself before a vast iron gate, rusty and closed. Here he paused a moment, looking through the bars. The château was near the road. This was at once its merit and its defect. But its aspect was extremely impressive. Newman learned afterwards from a guide-book of the province that it dated from the time of Henry IV. It presented to the wide, paved area which preceded it, and which was edged with shabby farm buildings, an immense façade of dark, time-stained brick, flanked by two low wings, each of which terminated in a little Dutch-looking pavilion capped with a fantastic roof. Two towers rose behind, and behind the towers was a mass of elms and beeches, now just faintly green. But the great feature was a wide, green river which washed the foundations of the château. The building rose from an island in the circling stream, so that this formed a perfect moat, spanned by a two-arched bridge without a parapet. The dull brick walls, which here and there made a grand, straight sweep, the ugly little cupolas of the wings, the deep-set windows, the long steep pinnacles of mossy slate, all mirrored themselves in the tranquil river. Newman rang at the gate, and was almost frightened at the tone with which a big rusty bell above his head replied to him. An old woman came out from the gatehouse and opened the creaking portal just wide enough for him to pass, and he went in, across the dry, bare court and the little cracked white slabs of the causeway on the moat. At the door of the château he waited for some moments, and this gave him a chance to observe that Fleurières was not kept up, and to reflect that it was a melancholy place of residence. "It looks," said Newman to himself, and I give the comparison for what it is worth, "like a Chinese penitentiary." At last the door was opened by a servant whom he remembered to have seen in the Rue de l'Université. The man's dull face brightened as he perceived our hero, for Newman, for indefinable reasons, enjoyed the confidence of the liveried gentry. The footman led the way across a great central vestibule, with a pyramid of plants in tubs in the middle of glass doors all around, to what appeared to be the principal drawing-room of the château. Newman crossed the threshold of a room of superb proportions, which made him feel at first like a tourist with a guide-book and a cicerone awaiting a fee. But when his guide had left him alone, with the observation that he would call Madame la Comtesse, Newman perceived that the salon contained little that was remarkable, save a dark ceiling with curiously carved rafters, some curtains of elaborate, antiquated tapestry, and a dark oaken floor polished like a mirror. He waited some minutes, walking up and down, but at length as he turned at the end of the room he saw that Madame de Cintré had come in by a distant door. She wore a black dress, and she stood looking at him. As the length of the immense room lay between them, he had time to look at her before they met in the middle of it. He was dismayed at the change in her appearance. Pale, heavy-browed, almost haggard, with a sort of monastic rigidity in her dress, she had little but her pure features in common with the woman whose radiant good grace he had hitherto admired. She let her eyes rest on his own, and she let him take her hand, but her eyes looked like two rainy autumn moons, and her touch was portentously lifeless. "I was at your brother's funeral," Newman said. "Then I waited 3 days. But I could wait no longer." "Nothing can be lost or gained by waiting," said Madame de Cintré. "But it was very considerate of you to wait. wronged as you have been." "I'm glad you think I have been wronged," said Newman, with that oddly humorous accent with which he often uttered words of the gravest meaning. "Do I need to say so?" she asked. "I don't think I have wronged, seriously, many persons, certainly not consciously. To you, to whom I have done this hard and cruel thing, the only reparation I can make is to say, I know it, I feel it. The reparation is pitifully small." "Oh, it's a great step forward," said Newman, with a gracious smile of encouragement. He pushed a chair towards her and held it, looking at her urgently. She sat down mechanically, and he seated himself near her, but in a moment he got up, restlessly, and stood before her. She remained seated, like a troubled creature who had passed through the stage of restlessness. "I say nothing is to be gained by seeing you," she went on, "and yet I am very glad you came. Now I can tell you what I feel. It is a selfish pleasure, but it is one of the last I shall have." And she paused with her great misty eyes fixed upon him. "I know how I have deceived and injured you. I know how cruel and cowardly I have been. I see it as vividly as you do. I feel it to the ends of my fingers." And she unclasped her hands, which were locked together in her lap, lifted them and dropped them at her side. "Anything that you may have said of me in your angriest passion is nothing to what I have said to myself." "In my angriest passion," said Newman, "I have said nothing hard of you. The very worst thing I have said of you yet is that you are the loveliest of women." And he seated himself before her again abruptly. She flushed a little, but even her flush was pale. "That is because you think I will come back. But I will not come back. It is in that hope that you have come here, I know. I am very sorry for you. I would do almost anything for you. To say that, after what I have done, seems simply impudent. But what can I say that will not seem impudent? To wrong you and apologize, that is easy enough. I should not have wronged you." She stopped a moment, looking at him, and motioned him to let her go on. "I ought never to have listened to you at first. That was the wrong. No good could come of it. I felt it, and yet I listened. That was your fault. I liked you too much. I believed in you." "And you don't believe in me now?" "More than ever. But now it doesn't matter. I have given you up." Newman gave a powerful thump with his clenched fist upon his knee. "Why, why, why?" he cried. "Give me a reason, a decent reason. You are not a child. You are not a minor, nor an idiot. You are not obliged to drop me because your mother told you to. Such a reason isn't worthy of you." "I know that. It's not worthy of me, but it's the only one I have to give. After all," said Madame de Cintré, throwing out her hands, "think me an idiot and forget me. That will be the simplest way." Newman got up and walked away with a crushing sense that his cause was lost, and yet with an equal inability to give up fighting. He went to one of the great windows and looked out at the stiffly embanked river and the formal gardens which lay beyond it. When he turned round, Madame de Cintré had risen. She stood there, silent and passive. "You are not frank," said Newman. "You are not honest. Instead of saying that you are imbecile, you should say that other people are wicked. Your mother and your brother have been false and cruel. They have been so to me, and I am sure they have been so to you. Why do you try to shield them? Why do you sacrifice me to them? I'm not false. I'm not cruel. You don't know what you give up. I can tell you that. You don't. They bully you and plot about you, and I, and he paused, holding out his hands. She turned away and began to leave him. "You told me the other day that you were afraid of your mother," he said, following her. "What did you mean?" Madame de Cintré shook her head. "I remember. I was sorry afterwards." "You were sorry when she came down and put on the thumbscrews? In God's name, what is it she does to you?" Nothing. Nothing that you can understand. And now that I have given you up, I must not complain of her to you." "That's no reasoning," said Newman. "Complain of her, on the contrary. Tell me all about it, frankly and trustfully as you ought, and we will talk it over so satisfactorily that you won't give me up." Madame de Cintré looked down some moments fixedly, and then, raising her eyes, she said, "One good at least has come of this. I have made you judge me more fairly. You thought of me in a way that did me great honor. I don't know why you had taken it into your head. But it left me no loophole for escape, no chance to be the common, weak creature I am. It was not my fault. I warned you from the first. But I ought to have warned you more. I ought to have convinced you that I was doomed to disappoint you. But I was, in a way, too proud. You see what my superiority amounts to, I hope," she went on, raising her voice with a tremor, which even then and there Newman thought beautiful. "I am too proud to be honest. I am not too proud to be faithless. I am timid and cold and selfish. I am afraid of being uncomfortable." "And you call marrying me uncomfortable?" said Newman, staring. Madame de Cintré blushed a little, and seemed to say that if begging his pardon in words was impudent, she might at least thus mutely express her perfect comprehension of his finding her conduct odious. "It is not marrying you. It is doing all that would go with it. It's the rupture, the defiance, the insisting upon being happy in my own way. What right have I to be happy when—" and she paused. "When what?" said Newman. "When others have been most unhappy." "What others?" Newman asked. "What have you to do with any others but me? Besides, you said just now that you wanted happiness, and that you should find it by obeying your mother. You contradict yourself." "Yes, I contradict myself. That shows you that I am not even intelligent." "You are laughing at me," cried Newman. "You are mocking me." She looked at him intently, and an observer might have said that she was asking herself whether she might not most quickly end their common pain by confessing that she was mocking him. "No, I am not," she presently said. "Granting that you are not intelligent," he went on, "that you are weak, that you are common, that you are nothing that I have believed you were, what I ask of you is not heroic effort. It is a very common effort. There is a great deal on my side to make it easy. The simple truth is that you don't care enough about me to make it." "I am cold," said Madame de Cintré. "I am as cold as that flowing river." Newman gave a great rap on the floor with his stick and a long, grim laugh. "Good, good!" he cried. "You go altogether too far. You overshoot the mark. There isn't a woman in the world as bad as you would make yourself out. I see your game. It's what I said. You are blackening yourself to whiten the others. You don't want to give me up at all. You like me. You like me. I know you do. You have shown it, and I have felt it. After that you may be as cold as you please. They have bullied you, I say. They have tortured you. It's an outrage, and I insist upon saving you from the extravagance of your own generosity. Would you chop off your hand if your mother requested it?" Madame de Cintré looked a little frightened. "I spoke of my mother too blindly the other day. I am my own mistress, by law and by her approval. She can do nothing to me. She has done nothing. She has never alluded to those hard words I used about her." "She has made you feel them, I'll promise you," said Newman. "It's my conscience that makes me feel them." "Your conscience seems to me to be rather mixed," exclaimed Newman passionately. "It has been in great trouble, but now is very clear," said Madame de Cintré. "I don't give you up for any worldly advantage or for any worldly happiness." "Oh, you don't give me up for Lord Deepmere, I know," said Newman. "I won't pretend, even to provoke you, that I think that. But that's what your mother and your brother wanted. And your mother, at that villainous ball of hers, I liked it at the time, but the very thought of it now makes me rabid, tried to push him on to make up to you." "Who told you this?" said Madame de Cintré softly. "Not Valentin. I observed it. I guessed it. I didn't know at the time that I was observing it, but it stuck in my memory. And afterwards, you recollect, I saw Lord Deepmere with you in the conservatory. You said that you would tell me at another time what he had said to you." "That was before this," said Madame de Cintré. "It doesn't matter," said Newman. "And besides, I think I know. He's an honest little Englishman. He came and told you what your mother was up to, that she wanted him to supplant me, not being a commercial person. If he would make you an offer, she would undertake to bring you over and give me the slip. Lord Deepmere isn't very intellectual, so she had to spell it out to him. He said that he admired you no end, and that he wanted you to know it, but he didn't like being mixed up with that sort of underhand work, and he came to you and told tales. That was about the amount of it, wasn't it? And then you said you were perfectly happy." "I don't see why we should talk of Lord Deepmere," said Madame de Cintré. "It was not for that you came here. And about my mother, it doesn't matter what you suspect and what you know. When once my mind has been made up, as it is now, I should not discuss these things. Discussing anything now is very idle. We must try and live each as we can. I believe you will be happy again, even sometimes when you think of me. When you do so, think this, that it was not easy, and that I did the best I could. I have things to reckon with that you don't know. I mean, I have feelings. I must do as they force me. I must. They would haunt me otherwise," she cried with vehemence. "They would kill me." "I know what your feelings are. They are superstitions. They are the feeling that, after all, though I am a good fellow, I have been in business. The feeling that your mother's looks are law and your brother's words are gospel, that you all hang together, and that it's a part of the everlasting proprieties that they should have a hand in everything you do. It makes my blood boil. That is cold. You are right. And what I feel here," and Newman struck his heart and became more poetical than he knew, "is a glowing fire." A spectator less preoccupied than Madame de Cintré's distracted wooer would have felt sure from the first that her appealing calm of manner was the result of violent effort, in spite of which the tide of agitation was rapidly rising. On these last words of Newman's it overflowed, though at first she spoke low for fear of her voice betraying her. "No, I was not right. I am not cold. I believe that if what I am doing seems so bad, it is not mere weakness and falseness. Mr. Newman, it's like a religion. I can't tell you, I can't. It's cruel of you to insist. I don't see why I shouldn't ask you to believe me and pity me. It's like a religion. There's a curse upon the house. I don't know what, I don't know why, don't ask me. We must all bear it. I have been too selfish. I wanted to escape from it. You offered me a great chance, besides my liking you. It seemed good to change completely, to break, to go away. And then I admired you. But I can't. It has overtaken and come back to me." Her self-control had now completely abandoned her, and her words were broken with long sobs. "Why do such dreadful things happen to us? Why is my brother Valentin killed like a beast in the midst of his youth and his gaiety and his brightness and all that we loved him for? Why are there things I can't ask about, that I am afraid to know? Why are there places I can't look at, sounds I can't hear? Why is it given to me to choose, to decide in a case so hard and terrible as this? I am not meant for that. I am not made for boldness and defiance. I was made to be happy in a quiet, natural way." At this Newman gave a most expressive groan, but Madame de Cintré went on. I was made to do gladly and gratefully what is expected of me. My mother has always been very good to me. That's all I can say. I must not judge her. I must not criticize her. If I did, it would come back to me. I can't change." "No," said Newman bitterly. "I must change, if I break in two in the effort." "You are different. You are a man. You will get over it. You have all kinds of consolation. You were born, you were trained to changes. Besides, I shall always think of you." "I don't care for that," cried Newman. "You are cruel. You are terribly cruel. God forgive you. You may have the best reasons and the finest feelings in the world. That makes no difference. You are a mystery to me. I don't see how such hardness can go with such loveliness." Madame de Cintré fixed him a moment with her swimming eyes. "You believe I am hard, then?" Newman answered her look and then broke out, "You are a perfect, faultless creature. Stay by me." "Of course I am hard," she went on. "Whenever we give pain, we are hard. And we must give pain. That's the world. The hateful, miserable world. Ah!" And she gave a long, deep sigh. "I can't even say I am glad to have known you, though I am. That, too, is to wrong you. I can say nothing that is not cruel. Therefore let us part, without more of this. Good-bye." And she put out her hand. Newman stood and looked at it without taking it, and raised his eyes to her face. He felt himself like shedding tears of rage. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Where are you going?" "Where I shall give no more pain and suspect no more evil. I am going out of the world." "Out of the world?" "I am going into a convent." "Into a convent?" Newman repeated the words with deepest dismay. It was as if she had said that she was going into a hospital. "Into a convent? You?" "I told you that it was not for my worldly advantage or pleasure that I was leaving you." But still Newman hardly understood. "You are going to be a nun," he went on, "in a cell, for life, with a gown and white veil?" "A nun, a Carmelite nun," said Madame de Cintré, "for life, with God's leave." The idea struck Newman as too dark and horrible for belief, and made him feel as he would have done if she had told him that she was going to mutilate her beautiful face, or drink some potion that would make her mad. He clasped his hands and began to tremble visibly. "Madame de Cintré, don't," he said. "I beseech you, on my knees if you like, I'll beseech you." She laid her hand upon his arm with a tender, pitying, almost reassuring gesture. "You don't understand," she said. "You have wrong ideas. It's nothing horrible. It is only peace and safety. It is to be out of the world where such troubles as this come to the innocent, to the best. And for life, that's the blessing of it. They can't begin again." Newman dropped into a chair and sat looking at her with a long, inarticulate murmur. That this superb woman, in whom he had seen all human grace and household force, should turn from him and all the brightness that he offered her, him and his future and his fortune and his fidelity, to muffle herself in ascetic rags and entomb herself in a cell, was a confounding combination of the inexorable and the grotesque. As the image deepened before him, the grotesque seemed to expand and overspread it. It was a reduction to the absurd of the trial to which he was subjected. You a nun!" he exclaimed. "You with your beauty defaced, you behind locks and bars! Never, never, if I can prevent it." And he sprang to his feet with a violent laugh. "You can't prevent it," said Madame de Cintré, "and it ought, a little, to satisfy you. Do you suppose I will go on living in the world, still beside you and yet not with you? It is all arranged. Good-bye, good-bye." This time he took her hand, took it in both his own. "Forever?" he said. Her lips made an inaudible movement, and his own uttered a deep imprecation. She closed her eyes, as if with the pain of hearing it, and then he drew her towards him and clasped her to his breast. He kissed her white face. For an instant she resisted, and for a moment she submitted. Then, with force, she disengaged herself and hurried away over the long, shining floor. The next moment the door closed behind her. Newman made his way out as he could. End of Chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The American. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American by Henry James, Chapter 21. There is a pretty public walk at Poitiers, laid out upon the crest of the high hill around which the little city clusters, planted with thick trees and looking down upon the fertile fields in which the old English princes fought for their right and held it. Newman paced up and down this quiet promenade for the greater part of the next day, and let his eyes wander over the historic prospect, but he would have been sadly at a loss to tell you afterwards whether the latter was made up of coal-fields or of vineyards. He was wholly given up to his grievance, or which reflection by no means diminished the weight. He feared that Madame de Saintré was irretrievably lost, and yet, as he would have said himself, he didn't see his way clear to giving her up. He found it impossible to turn his back upon Fleurières and its inhabitants. It seemed to him that some germ of hope or reparation must lurk there somewhere, if he could only stretch his arm out far enough to pluck it. It was as if he had his hand on a doorknob and were closing his clenched fist upon him. He had thumped, he had called, he had pressed the door with his powerful knee and shaken it with all his strength, and dead, damning silence had answered him. And yet something held him there, something hardened the grasp of his fingers. Newman's satisfaction had been too intense, his whole plan too deliberate and mature, his prospect of happiness too rich and comprehensive for this fine moral fabric to crumble at a stroke. The very foundation seemed fatally injured, and yet he felt a stubborn desire still to try to save the edifice. He was filled with a sorer sense of wrong than he had ever known, or than he had supposed it possible he should know. To accept his injury and walk away without looking behind him was a stretch of good nature of which he found himself incapable. He looked behind him intently and continually, and what he saw there did not assuage his resentment. He saw himself trustful, generous, liberal, patient, easy, pocketing frequent irritation and furnishing unlimited modesty. To have eaten humble pie, to have been snubbed and patronized and satirized, and have consented to take it as one of the conditions of the bargain, to have done this, and done it all for nothing, surely gave one a right to protest. And to be turned off because one was a commercial person! As if he had ever talked or dreamed of the commercial since his connection with the Bellegardes began! As if he had made the least circumstance of the commercial! As if he would not have consented to confound the commercial 50 times a day, if it might have increased by a hair's breadth the chance of the Bellegardes not playing him a trick. Granted that being commercial was fair ground for having a trick played upon one, how little they knew about the class so designed and its enterprising way of not standing upon trifles. It was in the light of his injury that the weight of Newman's past endurance seemed so heavy. His actual irritation had not been so great, merged as it was in his vision of the cloudless blue that overarched his immediate wooing. But now his sense of outrage was deep, rancorous, and ever present. He felt that he was a good fellow wronged. As for Madame de Saintré's conduct, it struck him with a kind of awe, and the fact that he was powerless to understand it, or feel the reality of its motives, only deepened the force with which he had attached himself to her. He had never let the fact of her Catholicism trouble him. Catholicism to him was nothing but a name, and to express a mistrust of the form in which her religious feelings had molded themselves would have seemed to him on his own part a rather pretentious affectation of Protestant zeal. If such superb white flowers as that could bloom in Catholic soil, the soil was not insalubrious. But it was one thing to be a Catholic, and another to turn nun, on your hand. There was something lugubriously comical in the way Newman's thoroughly contemporaneous optimism was confronted with this dusky old-world expedient. To see a woman made for him, and for motherhood to his children, juggled away in this tragic travesty. It was a thing to rub one's eyes over, a nightmare, an illusion, a hoax. But the hours passed away without disproving the thing, and leaving him only the after-sense of the vehemence with which he had embraced Madame de Cintré. He remembered her words and her looks. He turned them over and tried to shake the mystery out of them and to infuse them with an endurable meaning. What had she meant by her feeling be a kind of religion? It was the religion simply of the family laws, the religion of which her implacable little mother was high priestess. Twist the thing about as her generosity would, the one certain fact was that they had used force against her. Her generosity had tried to screen them, but Newman's heart rose into his throat at the thought that they should go scot-free. The 24 hours wore themselves away, and the next morning Newman sprang to his feet with the resolution to return to Fleurières and demand another interview with Madame de Bellegarde and her son. He lost no time in putting it into practice. As he rolled swiftly over the excellent road in the little calèche furnished him at the inn at Poitiers, he drew forth, as it were, from the very safe place in his mind to which he had consigned it, the last information given him by poor Valentin. Valentin had told him he could do something with it, and Newman thought it would be well to have it at hand. This was, of course, not the first time, lately, that Newman had given it his attention. It was information in the rough, it was dark and puzzling, but Newman was neither helpless nor afraid. Valentin had evidently meant to put him in possession of a powerful instrument, though he could not be said to have placed the handle very securely within his grasp. But if he had not really told him the secret, he had at least given him the clue to it, a clue of which that queer old Mrs. Bread held the other end. Mrs. Bread had always looked to Newman as if she knew secrets, and as he apparently enjoyed her esteem, he suspected she might be induced to share her knowledge with him. So long as there was only Mrs. Bread to deal with, he felt easy. As to what there was to find out, he had only one fear, that it might not be bad enough. Then, when the image of the marquise and her son rose before him again, standing side by side, the old woman's hand in Urbain's arm, and the same cold, unsociable fixedness in the eyes of each, he cried out to himself that the fear was groundless. There was blood in the secret at the very last. He arrived at Fleurières almost in a state of elation. He had satisfied himself logically that in the presence of his threat of exposure they would, as he mentally phrased it, rattle down like unwound buckets. He remembered indeed that he must first catch his hare, first ascertain what there was to expose, but after that why shouldn't his happiness be as good as new again? Mother and son would drop their lovely victim in terror and take to hiding, and Madame de Cintré, left to herself, would surely come back to him. Give her a chance, and she would rise to the surface, return to the light. How could she fail to perceive that his house would be much the most comfortable sort of convent? Newman, as he had done before, left his conveyance at the inn, and walked the short remaining distance to the château. When he reached the gate, however, a singular feeling took possession of him, a feeling which, strange as it may seem, had its source in its unfathomable good nature. He stood there a while, looking through the bars at the large, time-stained face of the edifice, and wondering to what crime it was in that dark old house, with its flowery name, had given convenient occasion. It had given occasion, first and last, to tyrannies and sufferings enough, Newman said to himself. It was an evil-looking place to live in. Then suddenly came the reflection, what a horrible rubbish heap of iniquity to fumble in! The attitude of inquisitor turned its ignobler face, and with the same movement Newman declared that the Bellegardes should have another chance. He would appeal once more directly to their sense of fairness, and not to their fear, and if they should be accessible to reason, he need know nothing worse about them than what he already knew. That was bad enough. The gatekeeper let him in through the same stiff crevice as before, and he passed through the court and over the little rustic bridge on the moat. The door was opened before he had reached it, and, as if to put his clemency to rout with the suggestion of a richer opportunity, Mrs. Bread stood there awaiting him. Her face, as usual, looked as hopelessly blank as the tide-smoothed sea sand, and her black garments seemed of an intenser sable. Newman had already learned that her strange inexpressiveness could be a vehicle for emotion, and he was not surprised at the muffled vivacity with which she whispered, "I thought you would try again, sir. I was looking out for you." "I am glad to see you," said Newman. "I think you are my friend." Mrs. Bread looked at him opaquely. "I wish you well, sir, but it's vain wishing now." "You know, then, how they have treated me?" "Oh, sir," said Mrs. Bread, dryly, "I know everything." Newman hesitated a moment. "Everything?" Mrs. Bread gave him a glance somewhat more lucent. "I know at least too much, sir." "One can never know too much. I congratulate you. I have come to see Madame de Bellegarde and her son," Newman added. "Are they at home? If they are not, I will wait." "My lady is always at home," Mrs. Bread replied, "and the Marquis is mostly with her." "Please then tell them, one or the other or both, that I am here and that I desire to see them." Mrs. Bread hesitated. "May I take a great liberty, sir?" "You have never taken a liberty, but you have justified it," said Newman, with diplomatic urbanity. Mrs. Bread dropped her wrinkled eyes as if she were curtsying, but the curtsy stopped there. The occasion was too grave. "You have come to plead with them again, sir? Perhaps you don't know this, that Madame de Cintré returned this morning to Paris." "Ah, she's gone!" And Newman, groaning, smote the pavement with his stick. "She has gone straight to the convent, the Carmelites they call it. I see you know, sir. My lady and the Marquis take it very ill. It was only last night she told them." "Ah, she had kept it back, then?" cried Newman. "Good, good. And they are very fierce?" "They are not pleased," said Mrs. Bread, "but they may well dislike it. They tell me it's most dreadful, sir. Of all the nuns in Christendom, the Carmelites are the worst. You may say they are not really human, sir. They make you give up everything, forever. And to think of her there! If I was one that cried, sir, I could cry." Newman looked at her an instant. "We mustn't cry, Mrs. Bread. We must act. Go and call them." And he made a movement to enter farther. But Mrs. Bread gently checked him. "May I take another liberty? I am told you were with my dearest Mr. Valentin in his last hours. If you would tell me a word about him. The poor Count was my own boy, sir. For the first year of his life he was hardly out of my arms. I taught him to speak. And the Count spoke so well, sir. He always spoke well to his poor old Bread. When he grew up and took his pleasure, he always had a kind word for me. And to die in that wild way! They have a story that he fought with a wine merchant. I can't believe that, sir. And was he in great pain?" "You are a wise, kind old woman, Mrs. Bread," said Newman. "I hoped I might see you with my own children in your arms. Perhaps I shall yet." And he put out his hand. Mrs. Bread looked for a moment at his open palm, and then, as if fascinated by the novelty of the gesture, extended her own ladylike fingers. Newman held her hand firmly and deliberately, fixing his eyes upon her. "You want to know all about Mr. Valentin?" he said. "It would be a sad pleasure, sir." "I can tell you everything. Can you sometimes leave this place?" "The chateau, sir? I really don't know. I never tried." "Try then. Try hard. Try this evening at dusk. Come to me in the old ruin there on the hill, in the court before the church. I will wait for you there. I have something very important to tell you. An old woman like you can do as she pleases." Mrs. Bread stared, wondering, with parted lips. "Is it from the Count, sir?" she asked. "From the Count, from his deathbed," said Newman. "I will come then. I will be bold for once, for him." She led Newman into the great drawing-room with which he had already made acquaintance, and retired to execute his commands. Newman waited a long time. At last he was on the point of ringing the bell and repeating his request. He was looking round him for a bell when the Marquis came in with his mother on his arm. It will be seen that Newman had a logical mind when I say that he declared to himself, in perfect good faith, as a result of Valentin's dark hints, that his adversaries looked grossly wicked. "There is no mistake about it now," he said to himself as they advanced. "They're a bad lot. They have pulled off the mask." Madame de Bellegarde and her son certainly bore in their faces the signs of extreme perturbation. They looked like people who had passed a sleepless night. Confronted, moreover, with an annoyance which they hoped they had disposed of, it was not natural that they should have any very tender glances to bestow upon Newman. He stood before them, and such eye-beams as they found available they leveled at him, Newman feeling as if the door of a sepulchre had suddenly been opened and the damp darkness were being exhaled. "You see, I have come back," he said. "I have come to try again." "It would be ridiculous," said M. de Bellegarde, "to pretend that we are glad to see you, or that we don't question the taste of your visit." "Oh, don't talk about taste," said Newman with a laugh, "or that will bring us round to yours. If I consulted my taste, I certainly shouldn't have come to see you. Besides, I will make as short work as you please. Promise me to raise the blockade, to set Madame de Cintré at liberty, and I will retire instantly." "We hesitated as to whether we would see you," said Madame de Bellegarde, "and we were on the point of declining the honor. But it seemed to me that we should act with civility, as we have always done, and I wished to have the satisfaction of informing you that there are certain weaknesses that people of our way of feeling can be guilty of but once." "You may be weak but once, but you will be audacious many times, madam," Newman answered. "I didn't come, however, for conversational purposes. I came to say this, simply, that if you will write immediately to your daughter that you withdraw your opposition to her marriage, I will take care of the rest. You don't want her to turn nun. You know more about the horrors of it than I do. Marrying a commercial person is better than that. Give me a letter to her, signed and sealed, saying you retract and that she may marry me with your blessing, and I will take it to her at the convent and bring her out. There's your chance. I call those easy terms." "We look at the matter otherwise, you know. We call them very hard terms," said Urbain de Bellegarde. They had all remained standing rigidly in the middle of the room. "I think my mother will tell you that she would rather her daughter should become Sœur Catherine than Mrs. Newman." But the old lady, with the serenity of supreme power, let her son make her epigrams for her. She only smiled, almost sweetly, shaking her head and repeating, "But once, Mr. Newman, but once." Nothing that Newman had ever seen or heard gave him such a sense of marble hardness as this movement and the tone that accompanied it. "Could anything compel you?" he asked. "Do you know of anything that would force you?" "This language, sir," said the Marquis, "addressed to people in bereavement and grief, is beyond all qualification." "In most cases," Newman answered, "your objection would have some weight, even admitting that Madame de Cintré's present intentions make time precious. But I have thought of what you speak of, and I have come here today without scruple, simply because I consider your brother and you two very different parties. I see no connection between you. Your brother was ashamed of you. Lying there wounded and dying, the poor fellow apologized to me for your conduct. He apologized to me for that of his mother." For a moment the effect of these words was as if Newman had struck a physical blow. A quick flush leaped into the faces of Madame de Bellegarde and her son, and they exchanged a glance like a twinkle of steel. Urbain uttered two words which Newman but half heard, but of which the sense came to him as it were in the reverberation of the sound. "Le misérable." "You show little respect for the living," said Madame de Bellegarde, "but at least respect the dead. Don't profane, don't insult the memory of my innocent son." "I speak the simple truth," Newman declared, "and I speak it for a purpose. I repeat it distinctly. Your son was utterly disgusted. Your son apologized." Urbain de Bellegarde was frowning portentously, and Newman supposed he was frowning at poor Valentin's invidious image. Taken by surprise, his scant affection for his brother had made a momentary concession to dishonor. But not for an appreciable instant did his mother lower her flag. "You are immensely mistaken, sir," she said. "My son was sometimes light, but he was never indecent. He died faithful to his name." "You simply misunderstood him," said the Marquis, beginning to rally. "You affirm the impossible." "Oh, I don't care for poor Valentin's apology," said Newman. "It was far more painful than pleasant to me. This atrocious thing was not his fault. He never hurt me, or anyone else. He was the soul of honor. But it shows how he took it." "If you wish to prove that my poor brother in his last moments was out of his head, we can only say that under the melancholy circumstances nothing was more possible. But confine yourself to that." "He was quite in his right mind," said Newman, with gentle but dangerous doggedness. "I have never seen him so bright and clever. It was terrible to see that witty, capable fellow dying such a death. You know I was very fond of your brother, and I have further proof of his sanity," Newman concluded. The Marquise gathered herself together majestically. "This is too gross!" she cried. "We decline to accept your story, sir. We repudiate it. Urbain, open the door." She turned away, with an imperious motion, to her son, and passed rapidly down the length of the room. The Marquis went with her and held the door open. Newman was left standing. He lifted his finger as a sign to M. de Bellegarde, who closed the door behind his mother and stood waiting. Newman slowly advanced, more silent, for the moment, than life. The two men stood face to face. Then Newman had a singular sensation. He felt his sense of injury almost brimming over into jocularity. "Come," he said, "you don't treat me well. At least admit that." M. de Bellegarde looked at him from head to foot. and then in the most delicate, best-bred voice, "I detest you personally," he said. "That's the way I feel to you, but for politeness' sake I don't say it," said Newman. "It's singular I should want so much to be your brother-in-law, but I can't give it up. Let me try once more." And he paused a moment. "You have a secret. You have a skeleton in the closet." Monsieur de Bellegarde continued to look at him hard, but Newman could not see whether his eyes betrayed anything. The look of his eyes was always so strange. Newman paused again, and then went on. "You and your mother have committed a crime." At this Monsieur de Bellegarde's eyes certainly did change. They seemed to flicker like blown candles. Newman could see that he was profoundly startled, but there was something admirable in his self-control. "Continue," said Monsieur de Bellegarde. Newman lifted a finger and made it waver a little in the air. "Need I continue? You are trembling." "Pray, where did you obtain this interesting information?" Monsieur de Bellegarde asked very softly. "I shall be strictly accurate," said Newman. "I won't pretend to know more than I do. At present that is all I know. You have done something that you must hide, something that would damn you if it were known, something that would disgrace the name you are so proud of. I don't know what it is, but I can find out. Persist in your present course, and I will find out. Change it, let your sister go in peace, and I will leave you alone. It's a bargain?" The Marquis almost succeeded in looking untroubled. The breaking up of the ice in his handsome countenance was an operation that was necessarily gradual. But Newman's mildly syllabled argumentation seemed to press and press, and presently he averted his eyes. He stood some moments reflecting. "My brother told you this," he said, looking up. Newman hesitated a moment. "Yes, your brother told me." The Marquis smiled handsomely. "Didn't I say that he was out of his mind?" "He was out of his mind if I don't find out. He was very much in it if I do." Monsieur de Bellegarde gave a shrug. "Eh, sir, find out or not, as you please." "I don't frighten you?" demanded Newman. "That's for you to judge." "No, it's for you to judge, at your leisure. Think it over, feel yourself all round. I will give you an hour or two. I can't give you more, for how do we know how fast they may be making Madame de Cintré a nun? Talk it over with your mother. Let her judge whether she is frightened. I don't believe she is as easily frightened in general as you, but you will see. I will go and wait in the village, at the inn, and I beg you to let me know as soon as possible. Say by 3 o'clock. A simple yes or no on paper will do. Only, you know, in case of a yes, I shall expect you, this time, to stick to your bargain." And with this Newman opened the door and let himself out. The Marquis did not move, and Newman, retiring, gave him another look. "At the inn in the village," he repeated. Then he turned away altogether and passed out of the house. He was extremely excited by what he had been doing, for it was inevitable that there should be a certain emotion in calling up the spectre of dishonor before a family 1,000 years old. But he went back to the inn and contrived to wait there, deliberately, for the next 2 hours. He thought it more than probable that Urbain de Bellegarde would give no sign, for an answer to his challenge in either sense would be a confession of guilt. What he most expected was silence, in other words, defiance. But he prayed that, as he imagined it, his shot might bring them down. It did bring, by 3 o'clock, a note, delivered by a footman, a note addressed in Urbain de Bellegarde's handsome English hand. It ran as follows: "I cannot deny myself the satisfaction of letting you know that I return to Paris tomorrow with my mother, in order that we may see my sister and confirm her in the resolution which is the most effectual reply to your audacious pertinacity. Henri Urbain de Bellegarde. Newman put the letter into his pocket, and continued his walk up and down the inn parlor. He had spent most of his time for the past week in walking up and down. He continued to measure the length of the little salle of the Armes de France until the day began to wane, when he went out to keep his rendezvous with Mrs. Bread. The path which led up the hill to the ruin was easy to find, and Newman in a short time had followed it to the top. He passed beneath the rugged arch of the castle wall, and looked about him in the early dusk for an old woman in black. The castle yard was empty, but the door of the church was open. Newman went into the little nave, and of course found a deeper dusk than without. A couple of tapers, however, twinkled on the altar, and just enabled him to perceive a figure seated by one of the pillars. Closer inspection helped him to recognize Mrs. Bread, in spite of the fact that she was dressed with unwonted splendor. She wore a large black silk bonnet with imposing bows of crape, and an old black satin dress disposed itself in vaguely lustrous folds about her person. She had judged it proper to the occasion to appear in her stateliest apparel. She had been sitting with her eyes fixed upon the ground, but when Newman passed before her, she looked up at him, and then she rose. "Are you a Catholic, Mrs. Bread?" he asked. "No, sir, I'm a good Church of England woman, very low," she answered. "But I thought I should be safer in here than outside. I was never out in the evening before, sir." "We shall be safer," said Newman, "where no one can hear us." And he led the way back into the castle court, and then followed a path beside the church, which he was sure must lead into another part of the ruin. He was not deceived. It wandered along the crest of the hill and terminated before a fragment of wall pierced by a rough aperture which had once been a door. Through this aperture Newman passed, and found himself in a nook peculiarly favorable to quiet conversation, as probably many an earnest couple, otherwise assorted than our friends, had assured themselves. The hill sloped abruptly away, and on the remnant of its crest were scattered 2 or 3 fragments of stone. Beneath, over the plain, lay the gathered twilight, through which, in the near distance, gleamed 2 or 3 lights from the chateau. Mrs. Bread rustled slowly after her guide, and Newman, satisfying himself that one of the fallen stones was steady, proposed her to sit upon it. She cautiously complied, and he placed himself upon another near her. Chapter 22 of The American. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American by Henry James. Chapter 22. "I am very much obliged to you for coming," Newman said. "I hope it won't get you into trouble." "I don't think I shall be missed. My lady, in these days, is not fond of having me about her." This was said with a certain fluttered eagerness which increased Newman's sense of having inspired the old woman with confidence. "From the first, you know," he answered, "you took an interest in my prospects. You were on my side. That gratified me, I assure you. And now that you know what they have done to me, I am sure you are with me all the more." "They have not done well, I must say it," said Mrs. Bread. "But you mustn't blame the poor Countess. They pressed her hard." "I would give $1,000,000 to know what they did to her," cried Newman. Mrs. Bread sat with a dull, oblique gaze fixed upon the lights of the chateau. "They worked on her feelings. They knew that was the way. She is a delicate creature. They made her feel wicked. She is only too good." "Ah, they made her feel wicked," said Newman slowly. and then he repeated it. They made her feel wicked. They made her feel wicked. The word seemed to him for the moment a vivid description of infernal ingenuity. It was because she was so good that she gave up, poor sweet lady, added Mrs. Bread. But she was better to them than to me, said Newman. She was afraid, said Mrs. Bread, very confidently. She has always been afraid, or at least for a long time. That was the real trouble, sir. She was like a fair peach, I may say, with just one little speck. She had one little sad spot. You pushed her into the sunshine, sir, and it almost disappeared. Then they pulled her back into the shade, and in a moment it began to spread. Before we knew it, she was gone. She was a delicate creature. This singular attestation of Madame de Cintré's delicacy, for all its singularity, set Newman's wound aching afresh. "I see," he presently said. "She knew something bad about her mother." "No, sir, she knew nothing," said Mrs. Bread, holding her head very stiff and keeping her eyes fixed upon the glimmering windows of the château. "She guessed something, then, or suspected it?" "She was afraid to know," said Mrs. Bread. "But you know, at any rate," said Newman. She slowly turned her vague eyes upon Newman, squeezing her hands together in her lap. "You are not quite faithful, sir. I thought it was to tell me about Mr. Valentin you asked me to come here." "Oh, the more we talk of Mr. Valentin, the better," said Newman. "That's exactly what I want. I was with him, as I told you, in his last hour. He was in a great deal of pain, but he was quite himself. You know what that means. He was bright and lively and clever." "Oh, he would always be clever, sir," said Mrs. Bread. "And did he know of your trouble?" "Yes, he guessed it of himself." "And what did he say to it?" "He said it was a disgrace to his name, but it was not the first." "Lord, Lord," murmured Mrs. Bread. "He said that his mother and his brother had once put their heads together and invented something even worse." "You shouldn't have listened to that, sir." "Perhaps not, but I did listen, and I don't forget it. Now I want to know what it is they did." Mrs. Bread gave a soft moan. "And you have enticed me up into this strange place to tell you?" "Don't be alarmed," said Newman. "I won't say a word that shall be disagreeable to you. Tell me as it suits you, and when it suits you. Only remember that it was Mr. Valentin's last wish that you should." "Did he say that?" "He said it with his last breath. Tell Mrs. Bread I told you to ask her." "Why didn't he tell you himself?" "It was too long a story for a dying man. He had no breath left in his body. He could only say that he wanted me to know, that wronged as I was, it was my right to know." "But how will it help you, sir?" said Mrs. Bread. "That's for me to decide. Mr. Valentin believed it would, and that's why he told me. Your name was almost the last word he spoke." Mrs. Bread was evidently awestruck by this statement. She shook her clasped hands slowly up and down. "Excuse me, sir," she said, "if I take a great liberty. Is it the solemn truth you are speaking? I must ask you that, must I not, sir?" "There's no offense. It is the solemn truth. I solemnly swear it. Mr. Valentin himself would certainly have told me more if he had been able." "Oh, sir, if he knew more!" "Don't you suppose he did?" "There's no saying what he knew about anything," said Mrs. Bread, with a mild headshake. "He was so mightily clever. He could make you believe he knew things that he didn't, and that he didn't know others that he had better not have known." "I suspect he knew something about his brother that kept the Marquis civil to him," Newman propounded. "He made the Marquis feel him. What he wanted was to put me in his place. He wanted to give me a chance to make the Marquis feel me." "Mercy on us!" cried the old waiting woman. "How wicked we all are!" "I don't know," said Newman. "Some of us are wicked, certainly. I am very angry, I am very sore, and I am very bitter, but I don't know that I am wicked. I have been cruelly injured. They have hurt me, and I want to hurt them. I don't deny that. On the contrary, I tell you plainly that it is the use I want to make of your secret." Mrs. Bread seemed to hold her breath. "You want to publish them? You want to shame them?" "I want to bring them down, 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 down. I want to turn the tables upon them. I want to mortify them as they mortified me. They took me up into a high place and made me stand there for all the world to see me, and then they stole behind me and pushed me into this bottomless pit where I lie howling and gnashing my teeth. I made a fool of myself before all their friends, but I shall make something worse of them." This passionate sally, which Newman uttered with a greater fervor that it was the first time he had had a chance to say all this aloud, kindled two small sparks in Mrs. Bread's fixed eyes. "I suppose you have a right to your anger, sir, but think of the dishonor you will draw down on Madame de Cintré." "Madame de Cintré is buried alive!" cried Newman. "What are honor or dishonor to her? The door of the tomb is at this moment closing behind her." "Yes, it's most awful," moaned Mrs. Bread. "She has moved off, like her brother Valentin, to give me room to work. It's as if it were done on purpose." "Surely," said Mrs. Bread, apparently impressed by the ingenuity of this reflection. She was silent for some moments. Then she added, "And would you bring my lady before the courts?" "The courts care nothing for my lady," Newman replied. "If she has committed a crime, she will be nothing for the courts but a wicked old woman." "And will they hang her, sir?" "That depends upon what she has done," and Newman eyed Mrs. Bread intently. "It would break up the family most terribly, sir." "It's time such a family should be broken up," said Newman with a laugh. "And me at my age out of place, sir," sighed Mrs. Bread. "Oh, I will take care of you. You shall come and live with me. You shall be my housekeeper, or anything you like. I will pension you for life." "Dear, dear, sir, you think of everything." And she seemed to fall a brooding. Newman watched her for a while, and then he said suddenly, "Ah, Mrs. Bread, you are too fond of my lady." She looked at him as quickly. "I wouldn't have you say that, sir. I don't think it any part of my duty to be fond of my lady. I have served her faithfully this many a year, but if she were to die to-morrow, I believe, before heaven, I shouldn't shed a tear for her." Then after a pause, "I have no reason to love her," Mrs. Bread added. "The most she has done for me has been not to turn me out of the house." Newman felt that decidedly his companion was more and more confidential, that if luxury is corrupting, Mrs. Bread's conservative habits were already relaxed by the spiritual comfort of this preconcerted interview in a remarkable locality with a free-spoken millionaire. All his native shrewdness admonished him that his part was simply to let her take her time, let the charm of the occasion work. So he said nothing. He only looked at her kindly. Mrs. Bread sat nursing her lean elbows. "My lady once did me a great wrong," she went on at last. "She has a terrible tongue when she is vexed. It was many a year ago, but I have never forgotten it. I have never mentioned it to a human creature. I have kept my grudge to myself. I dare say I have been wicked, but my grudge has grown old with me. It has grown good for nothing, too, I dare say. But it has lived along as I have lived. It will die when I die, not before." "And what is your grudge?" Newman asked. Mrs. Bread dropped her eyes and hesitated. "If I were a foreigner, sir, I should make less of telling you. It comes harder to a decent Englishwoman. But I sometimes think I have picked up too many foreign ways. What I was telling you belongs to a time when I was much younger and very different looking to what I am now. I had a very high color, sir, if you can believe it. Indeed, I was a very smart lass. My lady was younger, too, and the late Marquis was youngest of all. I mean in the way he went on, sir. He had a very high spirit. He was a magnificent man. He was fond of his pleasure, like most foreigners, and it must be owned that he sometimes went rather below him to take it. My lady was often jealous, and if you'll believe it, sir, she did me the honor to be jealous of me. One day I had a red ribbon in my cap, and my lady flew out at me and ordered me to take it off. She accused me of putting it on to make the Marquis look at me. I don't know that I was impertinent, but I spoke up like an honest girl and didn't count my words. A red ribbon, indeed! As if it was my ribbons the Marquis looked at. My lady knew afterwards that I was perfectly respectable, but she never said a word to show that she believed it. But the Marquis did," Mrs. Bread presently added. "I took off my red ribbon and put it away in a drawer where I have kept it to this day. It's faded now, it's a very pale pink, but there it lies. My grudge has faded, too. The red has all gone out of it, but it lies here yet." And Mrs. Bread stroked her black satin bodice. Newman listened with interest to this decent narrative, which seemed to have opened up the deeps of memory to his companion. Then, as she remained silent, and seemed to be losing herself in retrospective meditation upon her perfect respectability, he ventured upon a short cut to his goal. "So Madame de Bellegarde was jealous. I see. And Monsieur de Bellegarde admired pretty women, without distinction of class. I suppose one mustn't be hard upon him, for they probably didn't all behave so properly as you. But years afterwards it could hardly have been jealousy that turned Madame de Bellegarde into a criminal." Mrs. Bread gave a weary sigh. "We are using dreadful words, sir, but I don't care now. I see you have your idea, and I have no will of my own. My will was the will of my children, as I called them, but I have lost my children now. They are dead. I may say it of both of them. And what should I care for the living? What is any one in the house to me now? What am I to them? My lady objects to me. She has objected to me these 30 years. I should have been glad to be something to young Madame de Bellegarde, though I never was nurse to the present Marquis. When he was a baby, I was too young. They wouldn't trust me with him. But his wife told her own maid, Mademoiselle Clarisse, the opinion she had of me. Perhaps you would like to hear it, sir." "Oh, immensely," said Newman. "She said that if I would sit in her children's schoolroom, I should do very well for a pen wiper. When things have come to that, I don't think I need stand upon ceremony." "Decidedly not," said Newman. "Go on, Mrs. Bread." Mrs. Bread, however, relapsed again into troubled dumbness, and all Newman could do was to fold his arms and wait. But at last she appeared to have set her memories in order. "It was when the late Marquis was an old man, and his eldest son had been 2 years married. It was when the time came for marrying Mademoiselle Claire. That's the way they talk of it here, you know, sir. The Marquis's health was bad. He was very much broken down. My lady had picked out Monsieur de Saintré for no good reason that I could see. But there are reasons, I very well know, that are beyond me, and you must be high in the world to understand them. Old Monsieur de Saintré was very high, and my lady thought him almost as good as herself. That's saying a good deal. Mr. Urbain took sides with his mother, as he always did. The trouble, I believe, was that my lady would give very little money, and all the other gentlemen asked more. It was only Monsieur de Saintré that was satisfied. The Lord willed it that he should have that one soft spot. It was the only one he had. He may have been very grand in his birth, and he certainly was very grand in his bows and speeches, but that was all the grandeur he had. I think he was like what I have heard of comedians, not that I have ever seen one, but I know he painted his face. He might paint it all he would, he could never make me like it. The Marquis couldn't abide him, and declared that sooner than take such a husband as that Mademoiselle Claire should take none at all. He and my lady had a great scene. It came even to our ears in the servants' hall. It was not their first quarrel, if the truth must be told. They were not a loving couple, but they didn't often come to words, because, I think, neither of them thought the other's doings worth the trouble. My lady had long ago got over her jealousy, and she had taken to indifference. In this, I must say, they were well matched. The Marquis was very easy-going. He had a most gentlemanly temper. He got angry only once a year, but then it was very bad. He always took to bed directly afterwards. This time I speak of, he took to bed as usual, but he never got up again. I'm afraid the poor gentleman was paying for his dissipation. Isn't it true they mostly do, sir, when they get old? My lady and Mr. Urbain kept quiet, but I know my lady wrote letters to Monsieur de Saintré. The Marquis got worse, and the doctors gave him up. My lady, she gave him up too, and if the truth must be told, she gave up gladly. When once he was out of the way, she could do what she pleased with her daughter, and it was all arranged that my poor innocent child should be handed over to Monsieur de Saintré. You don't know what Mademoiselle was in those days, sir. She was the sweetest young creature in France, and knew as little of what was going on around her as the lamb does of the butcher. I used to nurse the Marquis, and I was always in his room. It was here at Fleurières in the autumn. We had a doctor from Paris who came and stayed 2 or 3 weeks in the house. Then there came 2 others, and there was a consultation, and these 2 others, as I said, declared that the Marquis couldn't be saved. After this they went off, pocketing their fees, but the other one stayed and did what he could. The Marquis himself kept crying out that he wouldn't die, that he didn't want to die, that he would live and look after his daughter. And she paused again, bending upon Newman a face which seemed to grow whiter as the darkness settled down upon them. Newman had listened eagerly, with an eagerness even greater than that with which he had bent his ear to Valentin de Bellegarde's last words. Every now and then, as his companion looked up at him, she reminded him of an ancient tabby cat, protracting the enjoyment of a dish of milk. Even her triumph was measured and decorous. The faculty of exultation had been chilled by disuse. She presently continued, "Late one night I was sitting by the Marquis in his room, the great red room in the west tower. He had been complaining a little, and I gave him a spoonful of the doctor's dose. My lady had been there in the early part of the evening. She sat far more than an hour by his bed. Then she went away and left me alone. After midnight she came back, and her eldest son was with her. They went to the bed and looked at the Marquis, and my lady took hold of his hand. Then she turned to me and said he was not so well. I remembered how the Marquis, without saying anything, lay staring at her. I can see his white face at this moment in the great black square between the bed curtains. I said I didn't think he was very bad, and she told me to go to bed. She would sit a while with him. When the Marquis saw me going, he gave a sort of groan, and called out to me not to leave him, but Mr. Urbain opened the door for me and pointed the way out. The present Marquis, perhaps you have noticed, sir, has a very proud way of giving orders, and I was there to take orders. I went to my room, but I wasn't easy. I couldn't tell you why. I didn't undress. I sat there waiting and listening. For what, would you have said, sir? I couldn't have told you, for surely a poor gentleman might be comfortable with his wife and son. It was as if I had expected to hear the Marquis moaning after me again. I listened, but I heard nothing. It was a very still night. I never knew a night so still. At last the very stillness itself seemed to frighten me, and I came out of my room and went very softly downstairs. In the ante-room, outside of the Marquis's chamber, I found Mr. Urbain walking up and down. He asked me what I wanted, and I said I came back to relieve my lady. He said he would relieve my lady, and ordered me back to bed, but as I stood there, unwilling to turn away, the door of the room opened, and my lady came out. I noticed she was very pale, she was very strange. She looked a moment at the Count and at me, and then she held out her arms to the Count. He went to her, and she fell upon him and hid her face. I went quickly past her into the room and to the Marquis's bed. He was lying there, very white, with his eyes shut like a corpse. I took hold of his hand and spoke to him, and he felt to me like a dead man. Then I turned round. My lady and Mr. Urbain were there. "My poor Bread," said my lady, "Monsieur le Marquis is gone." Mr. Urbain knelt down by the bed and said softly, "Mon père, mon père." I thought it wonderful strange, and asked my lady what in the world had happened, and why she hadn't called me. She said nothing had happened, that she had only been sitting there with the Marquis, very quiet. She had closed her eyes, thinking she might sleep, and she had slept, she didn't know how long. When she woke up, he was dead. "It's death, my son, it's death," she said to the Count. Mr. Urbain said they must have the doctor immediately from Poitiers, and that he would ride off and fetch him. He kissed his father's face, and then he kissed his mother and went away. My lady and I stood there at the bedside. As I looked at the poor Marquis, it came into my head that he was not dead, that he was in a kind of swoon. And then my lady repeated, "My poor Bread, it's death, it's death." And I said, "Yes, my lady, it's certainly death." I said just the opposite to what I believed. It was my notion. Then my lady said we must wait for the doctor, and we sat there and waited. It was a long time. The poor Marquis neither stirred nor changed. "I have seen death before," said my lady, "and it's terribly like this." "Yes, please, my lady," said I, and I kept thinking. The night wore away without the Count's coming back, and my lady began to be frightened. She was afraid he had an accident in the dark, or met with some wild people. At last she got so restless that she went below to watch in the court for her son's return. I sat there alone, and the Marquis never stirred. Here Mrs. Bread paused again, and the most artistic of romancers could not have been more effective. Newman made a movement as if he were turning over the page of a novel. "So he was dead!" he exclaimed. 3 days afterwards he was in his grave," said Mrs. Bread sententiously. "In a little while I went away to the front of the house, and looked out into the court, and there, before long, I saw Mr. Urbain ride in alone. I waited a bit to hear him come upstairs with his mother, but they stayed below, and I went back to the Marquis's room. I went to the bed and held up the light to him, but I don't know why I didn't let the candlestick fall. The Marquis's eyes were open wide. They were staring at me. I knelt down beside him and took his hands, and begged him to tell me, in the name of wonder, whether he was alive or dead. Still he looked at me a long time, and then he made a sign to put my ear close to him. 'I am dead,' he said. 'I am dead. The Marquise has killed me.' I was all in a tremble. I didn't understand him. He seemed to be both a man and a corpse, if you can fancy, sir. 'But you'll get well now, sir,' I said. And then he whispered again, ever so weak, 'I wouldn't get well for a kingdom. I wouldn't be that woman's husband again.' And then he said more. He said she had murdered him. I asked him what she had done to him, but he only replied, 'Murder, murder, and she'll kill my daughter,' he said, 'my poor unhappy child.' And he begged me to prevent that. And then he said that he was dying, that he was dead. I was afraid to move or to leave him. I was almost dead myself. All of a sudden he asked me to get a pencil and write for him, and then I had to tell him that I couldn't manage a pencil. He asked me to hold him up in bed while he wrote himself, and I said he could never, never do such a thing. But he seemed to have a kind of terror that gave him strength. I found a pencil in the room and a piece of paper and a book, and I put the paper on the book and the pencil into his hand, and moved the candle near him. You will think all this very strange, sir, and very strange it was. The strangest part of it was that I believed he was dying, and that I was eager to help him to write. I sat on the bed and put my arm around him and held him up. I felt very strong. I believe I could have lifted him and carried him. It was a wonder how he wrote, but he did write, in a big scratching hand. He almost covered one side of the paper. It seemed a long time. I suppose it was 3 or 4 minutes. He was groaning terribly all the while. Then he said it was ended, and I let him down upon his pillows, and he gave me the paper and told me to fold it and hide it and give it to those who would act upon it. 'Whom do you mean?' I said. 'Who are those who will act upon it?' But he only groaned for an answer. He couldn't speak for weakness. In a few minutes he told me to go and look at the bottle at the chimney-piece. I knew the bottle he meant, the white stuff that was good for his stomach. I went and looked at it, but it was empty. When I came back his eyes were open, and he was staring at me, but soon he closed them, and he said no more. I hid the paper in my dress. I didn't look at what was written upon it, though I can read very well, sir, if I haven't any handwriting. I sat down near the bed, but it was nearly half an hour before my lady and the Count came in. The Marquis looked as he did when they left him, and I never said a word about his having been otherwise. Mr. Urbain said that the doctor had been called to a person in childbirth, but that he had promised to set out for Fleurières immediately. In another half hour he arrived, and as soon as he had examined the Marquis, he said that we had had a false alarm. The poor gentleman was very low, but he was still living. I watched my lady and her son when he said this, to see if they looked at each other, and I am obliged to admit that they didn't. The doctor said there was no reason he should die, he had been going on so well. And then he wanted to know how he had suddenly fallen off. He had left him so very hearty. My lady told her little story again, what she had told Mr. Urbain and me, and the doctor looked at her and said nothing. He stayed all the next day at the chateau, and hardly left the Marquis. I was always there. Mademoiselle and Mr. Valentin came and looked at their father, but he never stirred. It was a strange, deathly stupor. My lady was always about, her face was as white as her husband's, and she looked very proud, as I had seen her look when her orders or her wishes had been disobeyed. It was as if the poor Marquis had defied her, and the way she took it made me afraid of her. The apothecary from Poitiers kept the Marquis along through the day, and we waited for the other doctor from Paris, who, as I told you, had been staying at Fleurières. They had telegraphed for him early in the morning, and in the evening he arrived. He talked a bit outside with the doctor from Poitiers, and then they came in to see the Marquis together. I was with him, and so was Mr. Urbain. My lady had been to receive the doctor from Paris, and she didn't come back with them into the room. He sat down by the Marquis. I can see him there now, with his hand on the Marquis's wrist, and Mr. Urbain watching him with a little looking-glass in his hand. "I'm sure he's better," said the little doctor from Poitiers. "I'm sure he'll come back." A few moments after he said this the Marquis opened his eyes, as if he were waking up, and looked at us from one to the other. I saw him look at me very softly, as you'd say. At the same moment my lady came in on tiptoe. She came up to the bed and put her head between me and the Count. The Marquis saw her, and gave a long, most wonderful moan. He said something we couldn't understand, and he seemed to have a kind of spasm. He shook all over, and then closed his eyes, and the doctor jumped up and took hold of my lady. He held her for a moment a bit roughly. The Marquis was stone dead. This time there were those there that knew. Newman felt as if he had been reading by starlight the report of a highly important evidence in a great murder case. "And the paper, he said excitedly. "What was written upon it?" "I can't tell you, sir," answered Mrs. Bread. "I couldn't read it. It was in French." "But could no one else read it?" "I never asked a human creature." "No one has ever seen it?" "If you see it, you'll be the first." Newman seized the old woman's hand in both his own and pressed it vigorously. "I thank you ever so much for that," he cried. "I want to be the first. I want it to be my property and no one else's. You're the wisest old woman in Europe. And what did you do with the paper?" The information had made him feel extraordinarily strong. "Give it to me, quick." Mrs. Bread got up with a certain majesty. "It is not so easy as that, sir. If you want the paper, you must wait." "But waiting is horrible, you know," urged Newman. "I am sure I have waited. I have waited these many years," said Mrs. Bread. "That is very true. You have waited for me. I won't forget it. And yet how comes it you didn't do as Monsieur Bellegarde said, and show the paper to someone?" "To whom should I show it?" answered Mrs. Bread mournfully. "It was not easy to know, and many's the night I have lain awake thinking of it. 6 months afterwards, when they married Mademoiselle to her vicious old husband, I was very near bringing it out. I thought it was my duty to do something with it, and yet I was mightily afraid. I didn't know what was written on the paper or how bad it might be, and there was no one I could trust enough to ask. And it seemed to me a cruel kindness to do that sweet young creature, letting her know that her father had written her mother down so shamefully, for that's what he did, I suppose. I thought she would rather be unhappy with her husband than be unhappy that way. It was for her and for my dear Mr. Valentin that I kept quiet. Quiet, I call it, but for me it was a weary quietness. It worried me terribly, and it changed me altogether. But for others I held my tongue, and no one to this hour knows what passed between the poor Marquis and me." "But evidently there were suspicions," said Newman. "Where did Mr. Valentin get his ideas?" "It was the little doctor from Poitiers. He was very ill-satisfied, and he made a great talk. He was a sharp Frenchman, and coming to the house as he did day after day, I suppose he saw more than he seemed to see. And indeed the way the poor Marquis went off as soon as his eyes fell on my lady was a most shocking sight for anyone. The medical gentleman from Paris was much more accommodating, and he hushed up the other. But for all he could do, Mr. Valentin and Mademoiselle heard something. They knew their father's death was somehow against nature. Of course they couldn't accuse their mother, and as I tell you, I was as dumb as that stone. Mr. Valentin used to look at me sometimes, and his eyes seemed to shine, as if he were thinking of asking me something. I was dreadfully afraid he would speak, and I always looked away and went about my business. If I were to tell him, I was sure he would hate me afterwards, and that I could never have borne. Once I went up to him and took a great liberty. I kissed him as I had kissed him when he was a child. 'You oughtn't to look so sad, sir,' I said. 'Believe your poor old Bread. Such a gallant, handsome young man can have nothing to be sad about.' And I think he understood me. He understood that I was begging off, and he made up his mind in his own way. He went about with his unasked question in his mind, as I did with my untold tale. We were both afraid of bringing dishonor on a great house. And it was the same with Mademoiselle. She didn't know what happened. She wouldn't know. My lady and Mr. Urbain asked me no questions because they had no reason. I was as still as a mouse. When I was younger, my lady thought me a hussy, and now she thought me a fool. How should I have any ideas?" "But you say the little doctor from Poitiers made a talk," said Newman. "Did no one take it up?" "I heard nothing of it, sir. They are always talking scandal in these foreign countries, you may have noticed, and I suppose they shook their heads over Madame de Bellegarde. But after all, what could they say? The Marquis had been ill, and the Marquis had died. He had as good a right to die as any one. The doctor couldn't say he had not come honestly by his cramps. The next year the little doctor left the place and bought a practice in Bordeaux, and if there has been any gossip, it died out. And I don't think there could have been much gossip about my lady that anyone would listen to. My lady is so very respectable." Newman, at this last affirmation, broke into an immense, resounding laugh. Mrs. Bread had begun to move away from the spot where they were sitting, and he helped her through the aperture in the wall and along the homeward path. "Yes," he said, "my lady's respectability is delicious. It will be a great crash." They reached the empty space in front of the church, where they stopped a moment, looking at each other with something of an air of closer fellowship, like two sociable conspirators. "But what was it?" said Newman. "What was it she did to her husband? She didn't stab or poison him." "I don't know, sir. No one saw it." "Unless it was Mr. Urbain. You say he was walking up and down outside the room. Perhaps he looked through the keyhole. But no, I think that with his mother he would take it on trust." "You may be sure I have often thought of it," said Mrs. Bread. "I am sure she didn't touch him with her hands. I saw nothing on him anywhere. I believe it was in this way. He had a great fit of his pain, and he asked her for his medicine. Instead of giving it to him, she went and poured it away before his eyes. Then he saw what she meant, and weak and helpless as he was frightened, he was terrified. 'You want to kill me,' he said. 'Yes, Monsieur le Marquis, I want to kill you,' says my lady, and sits down and fixes her eyes upon him. You know my lady's eyes, I think, sir. It was with them she killed him. It was with that terrible strong will she put into them. It was like a frost on flowers." "Well, you are a very intelligent woman. You have shown great discretion," said Newman. "I shall value your services as housekeeper extremely." They had begun to descend the hill, and Mrs. Bread said nothing until they reached the foot. Newman strolled lightly beside her. His head was thrown back, and he was gazing at all the stars. He seemed to himself to be riding his vengeance along the Milky Way. "So you are serious, sir, about that?" said Mrs. Bread, softly. "About your living with me? Why, of course, I will take care of you to the end of your days. You can't live with those people any longer. And you oughtn't to, you know, after this. You give me the paper, and you move away." "It seems very flighty in me to be taking a new place at this time of life," observed Mrs. Bread, lugubriously. "But if you are going to turn the house upside down, I would rather be out of it." "Oh," said Newman, in the cheerful tone of a man who feels rich in alternatives, "I don't think I shall bring in the constables, if that's what you mean. Whatever Madame de Bellegarde did, I am afraid the law can't take hold of it. But I am glad of that. It leaves it altogether to me." "You are a mighty bold gentleman, sir," murmured Mrs. Bread, looking at him round the edge of her great bonnet. He walked with her back to the château. The curfew had tolled for the laborious villagers of Fleurières, and the street was unlighted and empty. She promised him that he should have the Marquis's manuscript in half an hour. Mrs. Bread, choosing not to go in by the great gate, they passed round by a winding lane to a door in the wall of the park, of which she had the key, and which would enable her to enter the château from behind. Newman arranged with her that he should await outside the wall her return with the coveted document. She went in, and his half hour in the dusky lane seemed very long. But he had plenty to think about. At last the door in the wall opened, and Mrs. Bread stood there with one hand on the latch and the other holding out a scrap of white paper, folded small. In a moment he was master of it, and it had passed into his waistcoat pocket. "Come and see me in Paris," he said. "We are to settle your future, you know, and I will translate poor Monsieur de Bellegarde's French to you." Never had he felt so grateful as at this moment for Monsieur Nioche's instructions. Mrs. Bread's dull eyes had followed the disappearance of the paper, and she gave a heavy sigh. "Well, you have done what you would with me, sir, and I suppose you will do it again. You must take care of me now. You are a terribly positive gentleman." "Just now," said Newman, "I'm a terribly impatient gentleman." And he bade her good night and walked rapidly back to the inn. He ordered his vehicle to be prepared for his return to Poitiers, and then he shut the door of the common salle and strode toward the solitary lamp on the chimney-piece. He pulled out the paper and quickly unfolded it. It was covered with pencil marks, which at first in the feeble light seemed indistinct. But Newman's fierce curiosity forced a meaning from the tremulous signs. The English of them was as follows: "My wife has tried to kill me, and she has done it. I am dying, dying horribly. It is to marry my dear daughter to Monsieur de Cintré. With all my soul I protest. I forbid it. I am not insane. Ask the doctors. Ask Mrs. B. It was alone with me here tonight. She attacked me and put me to death. It is murder, if murder ever was. Ask the doctors. Henri Urbain de Bellegarde." Chapter 23 of The American. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American by Henry James. Chapter 23. Newman returned to Paris the second day after his interview with Mrs. Bread. The morrow he had spent at Poitiers, reading over and over again the little document which he had lodged in his pocket-book, and thinking what he would do in the circumstances and how he would do it. He would not have said that Poitiers was an amusing place, yet the day seemed very short. Domiciled once more in the Boulevard Haussmann, he walked over to the Rue de l'Université and inquired of Madame de Bellegarde's portress whether the Marquise had come back. The portress told him that she had arrived with Monsieur le Marquis on the preceding day, and further informed him that if he desired to enter, Madame de Bellegarde and her son were both at home. As she said these words, the little white-faced old woman who peered out of the dusky gatehouse of the Hôtel de Bellegarde gave a small wicked smile, a smile which seemed to Newman to mean, "Go in if you dare." She was evidently versed in the current domestic history. She was placed where she could feel the pulse of the house. Newman stood a moment, twisting his moustache and looking at her. Then he abruptly turned away. But this was not because he was afraid to go in, though he doubted whether if he did so he should be able to make his way, unchallenged, into the presence of Madame de Cintré's relatives. Confidence, excessive confidence perhaps, quite as much as timidity, prompted his retreat. He was nursing his thunderbolt, he loved it, he was unable to part with it. He seemed to be holding it aloft in the rumbling, vaguely flashing air, directly over the heads of his victims, and he fancied he could see their pale, upturned faces. Few specimens of the human countenance had ever given him such pleasure as these, lighted in the lurid fashion I have hinted at, and he was disposed to sip the cup of contemplative revenge in a leisurely fashion. It must be added, too, that he was at a loss to see exactly how he could arrange to witness the operation of his thunder. To send in his card to Madame de Bellegarde would be a waste of ceremony. She would certainly decline to receive him. On the other hand, he could not force his way into her presence. It annoyed him keenly to think that he might be reduced to the blind satisfaction of writing her a letter, but he consoled himself in a measure with the reflection that a letter might lead to an interview. He went home, and feeling rather tired, nursing a vengeance was, it must be confessed, a rather fatiguing process. It took a good deal out of one. Flung himself into one of his brocaded fauteuils, stretched his legs, thrust his hands into his pockets, and while he watched the reflected sunset fading from the ornate housetops on the opposite side of the boulevard, began mentally to compose a cool epistle to Madame de Bellegarde. While he was so occupied, his servant threw open the door and announced ceremoniously, "Madame Brett." Newman roused himself expectantly, and in a few moments perceived upon his threshold the worthy woman with whom he had conversed to such good purpose on the starlit hilltop of Fleurières. Mrs. Bread had made for this visit the same toilet as for her former expedition. Newman was struck with her distinguished appearance. His lamp was not lit, and as her large, grave face gazed at him through the light dusk from under the shadow of her ample bonnet, he felt the incongruity of such a person presenting herself as a servant. He greeted her with high geniality and bade her come in and sit down and make herself comfortable. There was something which might have touched the springs both of mirth and of melancholy in the ancient maidenliness with which Mrs. Bread endeavored to comply with these directions. She was not playing at being fluttered, which would have been simply ridiculous. She was doing her best to carry herself as a person so humble that for her even embarrassment would have been pretentious. But evidently she had never dreamed of its being in her horoscope to pay a visit at nightfall to a friendly single gentleman who lived in theatrical-looking rooms on one of the new boulevards. "I truly hope I am not forgetting my place, sir," she murmured. "Forgetting your place?" cried Newman. "Why, you are remembering it. This is your place, you know. You are already in my service. Your wages as housekeeper began a fortnight ago. I can tell you my house wants keeping. Why don't you take off your bonnet and stay?" "Take off my bonnet," said Mrs. Bread, with timid literalness. "Oh, sir, I haven't my cap, and with your leave, sir, I couldn't keep house in my best gown." "Never mind your gown," said Newman cheerfully. "You shall have a better gown than that." Mrs. Bread stared solemnly, and then stretched her hands over her lusterless satin skirt, as if the perilous side of her situation were defining itself. "Oh, sir, I am fond of my own clothes," she murmured. "I hope you have left those wicked people, at any rate," said Newman. "Well, sir, here I am," said Mrs. Bread. "That's all I can tell you. Here I sit, poor Catherine Bread. It's a strange place for me to be. I don't know myself. I never supposed I was so bold. But indeed, sir, I have gone as far as my own strength will bear me." "Oh, come, Mrs. Bread," said Newman almost caressingly. Don't make yourself uncomfortable. Now's the time to feel lively, you know." She began to speak again with a trembling voice. "I think it would be more respectable if I could, and her voice trembled to a pause. "If you could give up this sort of thing altogether?" said Newman kindly, trying to anticipate her meaning, which he supposed might be a wish to retire from service. "If I could give everything up, sir, all I should ask is a decent Protestant burial." "Burial!" cried Newman, with a burst of laughter. "Why, to bury you now would be a sad piece of extravagance. It's only rascals who have to be buried to get respectable. Honest folks like you and me can live our time out, and live together. Come, did you bring your baggage?" "My box is locked and corded, but I haven't yet spoken to my lady." "Speak to her, then, and have done with it. I should like to have your chance," cried Newman. "I would gladly give it to you, sir. I have passed some weary hours in my lady's dressing-room, but this will be one of the longest. She will tax me with ingratitude." "Well," said Newman, "so long as you can tax her with murder." "Oh, sir, I can't, not I," sighed Mrs. Bread. "You don't mean to say anything about it? So much the better. Leave that to me." "If she calls me a thankless old woman," said Mrs. Bread, "I shall have nothing to say. But it is better so," she softly added. "She shall be my lady to the last. That will be more respectable." "And then you will come to me, and I shall be your gentleman," said Newman. "That will be more respectable still." Mrs. Bread rose with lowered eyes and stood a moment, then looking up she rested her eyes upon Newman's face. The disordered proprieties were somehow settling to rest. She looked at Newman so long and so fixedly, with such a dull, intense devotedness, that he himself might have had a pretext for embarrassment. At last she said gently, "You are not looking well, sir." "That's natural enough," said Newman. "I have nothing to feel well about. To be very indifferent and very fierce, very dull and very jovial, very sick and very lively all at once, why, it rather mixes one up." Mrs. Bread gave a noiseless sigh. "I can tell you something that will make you feel duller still, if you want to feel all one way, about Madame de Cintré." "What can you tell me?" Newman demanded. "Not that you have seen her." She shook her head. "No, indeed, sir, nor ever shall. That's the dullness of it. Nor my lady, nor Monsieur de Bellegarde." "You mean that she is kept so close?" "Close, close," said Mrs. Bread, very softly. These words for an instant seemed to check the beating of Newman's heart. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the old woman. "They have tried to see her, and she wouldn't? She couldn't?" "She refused, forever. I had it from my lady's own maid," said Mrs. Bread, "who had it from my lady. To speak of it to such a person my lady must have felt the shock. Madame de Cintré won't see them now, and now is her only chance. A while hence she will have no chance." "You mean the other women, the mothers, the daughters, the sisters, what is it they call them, won't let her?" "It is what they call the rule of the house, or of the order, I believe," said Mrs. Bread. "There is no rule so strict as that of the Carmelites. The bad women in the reformatories are fine ladies to them. They wear old brown cloaks, so the femme de chambre told me, that you wouldn't use for a horse blanket. And the poor countess was so fond of soft-feeling dresses. She would never have anything stiff. They sleep on the ground," Mrs. Bread went on. "They are no better, and she hesitated for a comparison. "They are no better than tinkers' wives. They give up everything down to the very name their poor old nurses called them by. They give up father and mother, brother and sister, to say nothing of other persons," Mrs. Bread delicately added. "They wear a shroud under their brown cloaks and a rope round their waists, and they get up on winter nights and go off into cold places to pray to the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary is a hard mistress." Mrs. Bread, dwelling on these terrible facts, sat dry-eyed and pale, with her hands clasped in her satin lap. Newman gave a melancholy groan and fell forward, leaning his head on his hands. There was a long silence, broken only by the ticking of the great gilded clock on the chimney-piece. "Where is this place? Where is the convent?" Newman asked at last, looking up. "There are two houses," said Mrs. Bread. "I found out. I thought you would like to know, though it's poor comfort, I think. One is in the Avenue de Messine. They have learned that Madame de Cintré is there. The other is in the Rue d'Enfer. That's a terrible name. I suppose you know what it means." Newman got up and walked away to the end of his long room. When he came back, Mrs. Bread had got up and stood by the fire with folded hands. "Tell me this," he said. "Can I get near her, even if I don't see her? Can I look through a grating or some such thing at the place where she is?" It is said that all women love a lover, and Mrs. Bread's sense of the pre-established harmony which kept servants in their place, even as planets in their orbit, not that Mrs. Bread had ever consciously likened herself to a planet, barely availed to temper the maternal melancholy with which she leaned her head on one side and gazed at her new employer. She probably felt for the moment as if 40 years before she had held him also in her arms. "That wouldn't help you, sir. It would only make her seem farther away." "I want to go there at all events," said Newman. "Avenue de Messine, you say? And what is it they call themselves?" "Carmelites," said Mrs. Bread. "I shall remember that." Mrs. Bread hesitated a moment, and then, "It's my duty to tell you this, sir," she went on. "The convent has a chapel, and some people are admitted on Sunday to the Mass. You don't see the poor creatures that are shut up there, but I am told you can hear them sing. It's a wonder they have any heart for singing. Some Sunday I shall make bold to go. It seems to me I should know her voice in 50. Newman looked at his visitor very gratefully. Then he held out his hand and shook hers. "Thank you," he said. "If anyone can get in, I will." A moment later Mrs. Bread proposed deferentially to retire, but he checked her and put a lighted candle into her hand. "There are half a dozen rooms there I don't use," he said, pointing through an open door. "Go and look at them and take your choice. You can live in the one you like best." From this bewildering opportunity Mrs. Bread at first recoiled, but finally, yielding to Newman's gentle, reassuring push, she wandered off into the dusk with her tremulous taper. She remained absent a quarter of an hour, during which Newman paced up and down, stopped occasionally to look out of the window at the lights on the boulevard, and then resumed his walk. Mrs. Bread's relish for her investigation apparently increased as she proceeded, but at last she reappeared and deposited her candlestick on the chimney-piece. "Well, have you picked one out?" asked Newman. "A room, sir. They are all too fine for a dingy old body like me. There isn't one that hasn't a bit of gilding." "It's only tinsel, Mrs. Bread," said Newman. "If you stay there a while it will all peel off of itself." And he gave a dismal smile. "Oh, sir, there are things enough peeling off already," rejoined Mrs. Bread, with a headshake. "Since I was there I thought I would look about me. I don't believe you know, sir. The corners are most dreadful. You do want a housekeeper, that you do. You want a tidy Englishwoman that isn't above taking hold of her broom." Newman assured her that he suspected, if he had not measured, his domestic abuses, and that to reform them was a mission worthy of her powers. She held her candlestick aloft again, and looked around the salon with compassionate glances. Then she intimated that she accepted the mission, and that its sacred character would sustain her in her rupture with Madame de Bellegarde. With this she curtsied herself away. She came back the next day with her worldly goods, and Newman, going into his drawing-room, found her upon her aged knees before a divan, sewing up some detached fringe. He questioned her as to her leave-taking with her late mistress, and she said it had proved easier than she had feared. "I was perfectly civil, sir, but the Lord helped me to remember that a good woman has no call to tremble before a bad one." "I should think so!" cried Newman. "And does she know you have come to me?" "She asked me where I was going, and I mentioned your name," said Mrs. Bread. "What did she say to that?" "She looked at me very hard, and she turned very red. Then she bade me leave her. I was all ready to go, and I had got the coachman, who is an Englishman, to bring down my poor box and to fetch me a cab. But when I went down myself to the gate, I found it closed. My lady had sent orders to the porter not to let me pass, and by the same orders the porter's wife, she is a dreadful sly old body, had gone out in a cab to fetch home Monsieur de Bellegarde from his club." Newman slapped his knee. "She is scared! She is scared!" he cried exultantly. "I was frightened too, sir," said Mrs. Bread, "but I was also mightily vexed. I took it very high with the porter and asked him by what right he used violence to an honorable Englishwoman who had lived in the house for 30 years before he was heard of. Oh, sir, I was very grand, and I brought the man down. He drew his bolts and let me out, and I promised the cabman something handsome if he would drive fast. But he was terribly slow. It seemed as if we should never reach your blessed door. I am all of a tremble still. It took me 5 minutes just now to thread my needle." Newman told her with a gleeful laugh that if she chose she might have a little maid on purpose to thread her needles, and he went away murmuring to himself that the old woman was scared. She was scared. He had not shown Mrs. Tristram the little paper that he carried in his pocket-book, but since his return to Paris he had seen her several times, and she had told him that he seemed to her to be in a strange way, an even stranger way than his sad situation made natural. Had his disappointment gone to his head? He looked like a man who was going to be ill, and yet she had never seen him more restless and active. One day he would sit hanging his head and looking as if he were firmly resolved never to smile again. Another, he would indulge in laughter that was almost unseemly, and make jokes that were bad even for him. If he was trying to carry off his sorrow, he at such times really went too far. She begged him of all things not to be strange. Feeling in a measure responsible as she did for the affair which had turned out so ill for him, she could endure anything but his strangeness. He might be melancholy if he would, or he might be stoical. He might be cross and cantankerous with her, and ask her why she had ever dared to meddle with his destiny. To this she would submit. For this she would make allowances. Only, for heaven's sake, let him not be incoherent. That would be extremely unpleasant. It was like people talking in their sleep. They always frightened her. And Mrs. Tristram intimated that, taking very high ground as regards the moral obligation which events had laid upon her, she proposed not to rest quiet till she should have confronted him with the least inadequate substitute for Madame de Cintré that the two hemispheres contained. "Oh," said Newman, "we are even now, and we had better not open a new account. You may bury me some day, but you shall never marry me. It's too rough. I hope, at any rate," he added, "that there is nothing incoherent in this, that I want to go next Sunday to the Carmelite chapel in the Avenue de Messine. You know one of the Catholic ministers, an abbé, is that it? I have seen him here, you know, that motherly old gentleman with the big waistband. Please ask him if I need a special leave to go in, and if I do, beg him to obtain it for me." Mrs. Tristram gave expression to the liveliest joy. "I am so glad you have asked me to do something," she cried. "You shall get into the chapel if the abbé is disfrocked for his share in it." And 2 days afterwards she told him that it was all arranged. The abbé was enchanted to serve him, Chapter 24 of The American. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American by Henry James, Chapter 24. Sunday was as yet 2 days off, but meanwhile, to beguile his impatience, Newman took his way to the Avenue de Messine and got what comfort he could in staring at the blank outer wall of Madame de Saintré's present residence. The street in question, as some travelers will remember, adjoins the Parc Monceau, which is one of the prettiest corners of Paris. The quarter has an air of modern opulence and convenience which seems at variance with the ascetic institution, and the impression made upon Newman's gloomily irritated gaze by the fresh-looking, windowless expanse behind which the woman he loved was perhaps even then pledging herself to pass the rest of her days, was less exasperating than he had feared. The place suggested a convent with the modern improvements, an asylum in which privacy, though unbroken, might be not quite identical with privation, and meditation, though monotonous, might be of a cheerful cast. And yet he knew the case was otherwise, only at present it was not a reality to him. It was too strange and too mocking to be real. It was like a page torn out of a romance, with no context in his own experience. On Sunday morning, at the hour which Mrs. Tristram had indicated, he rang the gate in the blank wall. It was instantly opened, and admitted him into a clean, cold-looking court, from beyond which a dull, plain edifice looked down upon him. A robust lay sister with a cheerful complexion emerged from a porter's lodge, and on his stating his errand pointed to the open door of the chapel, an edifice which occupied the right side of the court and was preceded by the high flight of steps. Newman ascended the steps and immediately entered the open door. Service had not yet begun. The place was dimly lighted, and it was some moments before he could distinguish its features. Then he saw it was divided by a large, closed iron screen into two unequal portions. The altar was on the hither side of the screen, and between it and the entrance were disposed several benches and chairs. 3 or 4 of these were occupied by vague, motionless figures that he presently perceived to be women, deeply absorbed in their devotion. The place seemed to Newman very cold. The smell of the incense itself was cold. Besides this, there was a twinkle of tapers, and here and there a glow of colored glass. Newman seated himself. The praying women kept still, with their backs turned. He saw they were visitors like himself, and he would have liked to see their faces, for he believed that they were the mourning mothers and sisters of other women who had had the same pitiless courage as Madame de Saintré. But they were better off than he, for at least they shared the faith to which the others had sacrificed themselves. 3 or 4 persons came in. 2 of them were elderly gentlemen. Everyone was very quiet. Newman fastened his eyes upon the screen behind the altar. That was the convent, the real convent, the place where she was. But he could see nothing. No light came through the crevices. He got up and approached the partition very gently, trying to look behind. But behind it there was darkness, with nothing stirring. He went back to his place, and after that a priest and 2 altar boys came in and began to say Mass. Newman watched their genuflections and gyrations with a grim, still enmity. They seemed aids and abettors of Madame de Saintré's desertion. They were mouthing and droning out their triumph. The priest's long, dismal intonings acted upon his nerves and deepened his wrath. There was something defiant in his unintelligible drawl. It seemed meant for Newman himself. Suddenly there arose from the depths of the chapel, from behind the inexorable grating, a sound which drew his attention from the altar, the sound of a strange, lugubrious chant uttered by women's voices. It began softly, but it presently grew louder, and as it increased, it became more of a wail and a dirge. It was the chant of the Carmelite nuns, their only human utterance. It was their dirge over their buried affections and over the vanity of earthly desires. At first Newman was bewildered, almost stunned, by the strangeness of the sound. Then, as he comprehended its meaning, he listened intently, and his heart began to throb. He listened for Madame de Cintré's voice, and in the very heart of the tuneless harmony he imagined he made it out. We are obliged to believe that he was wrong, inasmuch as she had obviously not yet had time to become a member of the invisible sisterhood. The chant kept on, mechanical and monotonous, with dismal repetitions and despairing cadences. It was hideous. It was horrible. As it continued, Newman felt that he needed all his self-control. He was growing more agitated. He felt tears in his eyes. At last, as in its full force the thought came over him that this confused, impersonal wail was all that either he or the world she had deserted should ever hear of the voice he had found so sweet, he found he could bear it no longer. He rose abruptly and made his way out. On the threshold he paused, listened again to the dreary strain, and then hastily descended into the court. As he did so, he saw the good sister with the high-colored cheeks and the fan-like frill to her coiffure, who had admitted him, and was in conference at the gate with two persons who had just come in. A second glance informed him that these persons were Madame de Bellegarde and her son, and that they were about to avail themselves of that method of approach to Madame de Cintré which Newman had found but a mockery of consolation. As he crossed the court, Monsieur de Bellegarde recognized him. The Marquis was coming to the steps, leading his mother. The old lady also gave Newman a look, and it resembled that of her son. Both faces expressed a franker perturbation, something more akin to the humbleness of dismay, than Newman had yet seen in them. Evidently he startled the Bellegarde, and they had not their grand behavior immediately in hand. Newman hurried past them, guided only by the desire to get out of the convent walls and into the street. The gate opened itself at his approach. He strode over the threshold, and it closed behind him. A carriage, which appeared to have been standing there, was just turning away from the sidewalk. Newman looked at it for a moment, blankly. Then he became conscious, through that dusky mist that swam before his eyes, that a lady seated in it was bowing to him. The vehicle had turned away before he recognized her. It was an ancient landau, with one half the cover lowered. The lady's bow was very positive, and accompanied him with a smile. A little girl was seated beside her. He raised his hat, and then the lady bade the coachman stop. The carriage halted again beside the pavement, and she sat there and beckoned to Newman, beckoned with the demonstrative grace of Madame Urbain de Bellegarde. Newman hesitated a moment before he obeyed her summons. During this moment he had time to curse his stupidity for letting the others escape him. He had been wondering how he could get at them. Fool that he was for not stopping them then and there. What better place than beneath the very prison walls to which they had consigned the promise of his joy? He had been too bewildered to stop them, but now he felt ready to wait for them at the gate. Madame Urbain, with a certain attractive petulance, beckoned to him again, and this time he went over to the carriage. She leaned out and gave him her hand, looking at him kindly and smiling. "Ah, monsieur," she said, "you don't include me in your wrath. I had nothing to do with it." "Oh, I don't suppose you could have prevented it," Newman answered in a tone which was not that of studied gallantry. What you say is too true for me to resent the small account it makes of my influence. I forgive you at any rate, because you look as if you had seen a ghost." "I have," said Newman. "I am glad, then, I didn't go in with Madame de Bellegarde and my husband. You must have seen them, eh? Was the meeting affectionate? Did you hear the chanting? They say it's like the lamentations of the damned. I wouldn't go in. One is certain to hear that soon enough. Poor Claire, in a white shroud and a big brown cloak. That's the toilette of the Carmelites, you know. Well, she was always fond of long, loose things. But I must not speak of her to you, only I must say that I am very sorry for you, that if I could have helped you I would, and that I think everyone has been very shabby. I was afraid of it, you know. I felt it in the air for a fortnight before it came. When I saw you at my mother-in-law's ball, taking it all so easily, I felt as if you were dancing on your grave. But what could I do? I wish you all the good I can think of. You will say that it isn't much. Yes, they have been very shabby. I am not a bit afraid to say it. I assure you everyone thinks so. We are not all like that. I am sorry I am not going to see you again. You know I think you very good company. I would prove it by asking you to get into the carriage and drive with me for a quarter of an hour while I wait for my mother-in-law. Only if we were seen, considering what has passed, and everyone knows you have been turned away, it might be thought I was going a little too far even for me. But I shall see you sometimes, somewhere, eh? You know," this was said in English, "we have a plan for a little amusement." Newman stood there with his hand on the carriage door, listening to this consolatory murmur with an unlighted eye. He hardly knew what Madame de Bellegarde was saying. He was only conscious that she was chattering ineffectively. But suddenly it occurred to him that, with her pretty professions, there was a way of making her effective. She might help him to get at the old woman and the Marquis. "They are coming back soon, your companions," he said. "You are waiting for them?" "They will hear the Mass out. There is nothing to keep them longer. Claire has refused to see them." "I want to speak to them," said Newman, "and you can help me. You can do me a favor. Delay your return for 5 minutes and give me a chance at them. I will wait for them here." Madame de Bellegarde clasped her hands with a tender grimace. "My poor friend, what do you want to do to them? To beg them to come back to you? It will be wasted words. They will never come back." "I want to speak to them all the same. Pray do what I ask you. Stay away and leave them to me for 5 minutes. You needn't be afraid. I shall not be violent. I am very quiet." "Yes, you look very quiet. If they had le cœur tendre you would move them. But they haven't. However, I will do better for you than what you propose. The understanding is not that I shall come back for them. I am going into the Parc Monceau with my little girl to give her a walk, and my mother-in-law, who comes so rarely into this quarter, is to profit by the same opportunity to take the air. We are to wait for her in the park, where my husband is to bring her to us. Follow me now. Just within the gates I shall get out of my carriage. Sit down on a chair in some quiet corner, and I will bring them near you. There's devotion for you. Le reste vous regarde." This proposal seemed to Newman extremely felicitous. It revived his drooping spirit, and he reflected that Madame Urbain was not such a goose as she'd seemed. He promised immediately to overtake her, and the carriage drove away. The Parc Monceau is a very pretty piece of landscape gardening, but Newman, passing into it, bestowed little attention upon its elegant vegetation, which was full of the freshness of spring. He found Madame de Bellegarde promptly, seated in one of the quiet corners of which she had spoken, while before her, in the alley, her little girl, attended by the footman and the lap-dog, walked up and down as if she were taking a lesson in deportment. Newman sat down beside the mamma, and she talked a great deal, apparently with the design of convincing him that, if he would only see it, poor dear Claire did not belong to the most fascinating type of woman. She was too tall and thin, too stiff and cold, her mouth was too wide and her nose too narrow, she had no dimples anywhere. And then she was eccentric in cold blood, she was an Anglaise after all. Newman was very impatient. He was counting the minutes until his victim should reappear. He sat silent, leaning upon his cane, looking absently and insensibly at the little marquise. At length Madame de Bellegarde said she would walk toward the gate of the park and meet her companions, but before she went she dropped her eyes, and after playing a moment with the lace of her sleeve, looked up again at Newman. "Do you remember," she asked, "the promise you made me 3 weeks ago?" And then, as Newman, vainly consulting his memory, was obliged to confess that the promise had escaped it, she declared that he had made her, at the time, a very queer answer, an answer at which, viewing it in the light of the sequel, she had fair ground for taking offense. "You promised to take me to Bullier's after your marriage. After your marriage. You made a great point of that. 3 days after that your marriage was broken off. Do you know, when I heard the news, the first thing I said to myself? Oh, heaven, now he won't go with me to Bullier's. And I really began to wonder if you had not been expecting the rupture." "Oh, my dear lady," murmured Newman, looking down the path to see if the others were not coming. "I shall be good-natured," said Madame de Bellegarde. "One must not ask too much of a gentleman who is in love with a cloistered nun. Besides, I can't go to Bullier's while we are in mourning. But I haven't given it up for that. The partie is arranged. I have my cavalier, Lord Deepmere, if you please. He has gone back to his dear Dublin, but a few months hence I am to name any evening, and he will come over from Ireland on purpose. That's what I call gallantry." Shortly after this, Madame de Bellegarde walked away with her little girl. Newman sat in his place. The time seemed terribly long. He felt how fiercely his quarter of an hour in the convent chapel had raked over the glowing coals of his resentment. Madame de Bellegarde kept him waiting, but she proved as good as her word. At last she reappeared at the end of the path with her little girl and her footman. Beside her slowly walked her husband, with his mother on his arm. They were a long time advancing, during which Newman sat unmoved. Tingling as he was with passion, it was extremely characteristic of him that he was able to moderate his expression of it, as he would have turned down a flaring gas-burner. His native coolness, shrewdness, and deliberateness, his lifelong submissiveness to the sentiment that words were acts and acts were steps in life, and that in this matter of taking steps, curveting and prancing were exclusively reserved for quadrupeds and foreigners. All this admonished him that rightful wrath had no connection with being a fool and indulging in spectacular violence. So as he rose, when old Madame de Bellegarde and her son were close to him, he only felt very tall and light. He had been sitting beside some shrubbery, in such a way as not to be noticeable at a distance. But Monsieur de Bellegarde had evidently already perceived him. His mother and he were holding their course, but Newman stepped in front of them, and they were obliged to pause. He lifted his hat slightly and looked at them for a moment. They were pale with amazement and disgust. "Excuse me for stopping you," he said in a low tone, "but I must profit by the occasion. I have 10 words to say to you. Will you listen to them?" The Marquis glared at him and then turned to his mother. "Can Mr. Newman possibly have anything to say that is worth our listening to?" "I assure you I have something," said Newman. "Besides, it is my duty to say it. It's a notification, a warning." "Your duty?" said old Madame de Bellegarde, her thin lips curving like scorched paper. "That is your affair. not ours." Madame Urbain, meanwhile, had seized her little girl by the hand with a gesture of surprise and impatience which struck Newman, intent as he was upon his own words, with its dramatic effectiveness. "If Mr. Newman is going to make a scene in public," she exclaimed, "I will take my poor child out of the mêlée. She is too young to see such naughtiness." And she instantly resumed her walk. "You had much better listen to me," Newman went on. "Whether you do or not, things will be disagreeable for you, but at any rate you will be prepared." "We have already heard something of your threats," said the Marquis, "and you know what we think of them." "You think a good deal more than you admit. A moment," Newman added in reply to an exclamation of the old lady. "I remember perfectly that we are in a public place, and you see I am very quiet. I am not going to tell your secret to the passers-by. I shall keep it, to begin with, for certain picked listeners. Anyone who observes us will think that we are having a friendly chat, and that I am complimenting you, madam, on your venerable virtues." The Marquis gave 3 short, sharp raps on the ground with his stick. "I demand of you to step out of our path," he hissed. Newman instantly complied, and M. de Bellegarde stepped forward with his mother. Then Newman said, "Half an hour hence Madame de Bellegarde will regret that she didn't learn exactly what I mean." The marquise had taken a few steps, but at these words she paused, looking at Newman with eyes like 2 scintillating globules of ice. "You are like a peddler with something to sell," she said, with a little cold laugh, which only partially concealed the tremor in his voice. "Oh no, not to sell," Newman rejoined. "I give it to you for nothing." And he approached nearer to her, looking her straight in the eyes. "You killed your husband," he said, almost in a whisper. "That is, you tried once and failed, and then, without trying, you succeeded." Madame de Bellegarde closed her eyes and gave a little cough, which, as a piece of dissimulation, struck Newman as really heroic. "Dear mother," said the Marquis, "does this stuff amuse you so much?" "The rest is more amusing," said Newman. "You had better not lose it." Madame de Bellegarde opened her eyes. The scintillations had gone out of them. They were fixed and dead. But she smiled superbly with her narrow little lips, and repeated Newman's word. "Amusing? Have I killed someone else?" "I don't count your daughter," said Newman, "though I might. Your husband knew what you were doing. I have a proof of it whose existence you have never suspected." And he turned to the Marquis, who was terribly white, whiter than Newman had ever seen anyone out of a picture. A paper written by the hand and signed with the name of Henri Urbain de Bellegarde, written after you, madame, had left him for dead, and while you, sir, had gone, not very fast, for the doctor. The Marquis looked at his mother. She turned away, looking vaguely round her. "I must sit down," she said in a low tone, going toward the bench on which Newman had been sitting. "Couldn't you have spoken to me alone?" said the Marquis to Newman, with a strange look. "Well, yes, if I could have been sure of speaking to your mother alone, too," Newman answered. "But I have had to take you as I could get you." Madame de Bellegarde, with a movement very eloquent of what he would have called her grit, her steel-cold pluck and her instinctive appeal to her own personal resources, drew her hand out of her son's arm and went and seated herself upon the bench. There she remained, with her hands folded in her lap, looking straight at Newman. The expression of her face was such that he fancied at first that she was smiling, but he went and stood in front of her and saw that her elegant features were distorted by agitation. He saw, however, equally, that she was resisting her agitation with all the rigor of her inflexible will, and there was nothing like either fear or submission in her stony stare. She had been startled, but she was not terrified. Newman had an exasperating feeling that she would get the better of him still. He would not have believed it possible that he could so utterly fail to be touched by the sight of a woman, criminal or other, in so tight a place. Madame de Bellegarde gave a glance at her son which seemed tantamount to an injunction to be silent and leave her to her own devices. The Marquis stood beside her, with his hands behind him, looking at Newman. "What paper is this you speak of?" asked the old lady, with an imitation of tranquillity which would have been applauded in a veteran actress. "Exactly what I have told you," said Newman. "A paper written by your husband after you had left him for dead, and during the couple of hours before you returned. You see, he had the time. You shouldn't have stayed away so long. It declares distinctly his wife's murderous intent." "I should like to see it," Madame de Bellegarde observed. "I thought you might," said Newman, "and I have taken a copy." And he drew from his waistcoat pocket a small folded sheet. "Give it to my son," said Madame de Bellegarde. Newman handed it to the Marquis, whose mother, glancing at him, said simply, "Look at it." Monsieur de Bellegarde's eyes had a pale eagerness which it was useless for him to try to dissimulate. He took the paper in his light-gloved fingers and opened it. There was a silence, during which he read it. He had more than time to read it, but still he said nothing. He stood staring at it. "Where is the original?" asked Madame de Bellegarde, in a voice which was really a consummate negation of impatience. "In a very safe place. Of course I can't show you that," said Newman. "You might want to take hold of it," he added with conscious quaintness. "But that's a very correct copy, except of course the handwriting. I am keeping the original to show someone else." Monsieur de Bellegarde at last looked up, and his eyes were still very eager. "To whom do you mean to show it?" "Well, I'm thinking of beginning with the Duchess," said Newman, "that stout lady I saw at your ball. She asked me to come and see her, you know. I thought at the moment I shouldn't have much to say to her, but my little document will give us something to talk about." "You had better keep it, my son," said Madame de Bellegarde. "By all means," said Newman. "Keep it and show it to your mother when you get home." "And after showing it to the Duchess?" asked the Marquis, folding the paper and putting it away. "Well, I'll take up the dukes," said Newman, "then the counts and the barons, all the people you had the cruelty to introduce me to in a character of which you meant immediately to deprive me. I have made out a list." For a moment neither Madame de Bellegarde nor her son said a word. The old lady sat with her eyes upon the ground. Monsieur de Bellegarde's blanched pupils were fixed upon her face. Then looking at Newman, "Is that all you have to say?" she asked. "No, I want to say a few words more. I want to say that I hope you quite understand what I'm about. This is my revenge, you know. You have treated me before the world, convened for that express purpose, as if I were not good enough for you. I mean to show the world that, however bad I may be, you are not quite the people to say it." Madame de Bellegarde was silent again, and then she broke her silence. Her self-possession continued to be extraordinary. "I needn't ask you who has been your accomplice. Mrs. Bread told me that you had purchased her services." "Don't accuse Mrs. Bread of venality," said Newman. "She has kept your secret all these years. She has given you a long respite. It was beneath her eyes your husband wrote that paper. He put it into her hands with a solemn injunction that she was to make it public. She was too good-hearted to make use of it." The old lady appeared for an instant to hesitate, and then, "She was my husband's mistress," she said softly. This was the only concession to self-defense that she condescended to make. "I doubt that," said Newman. Madame de Bellegarde got up from her bench. "It was not to your opinions I undertook to listen, and if you have nothing left but them to tell me, I think this remarkable interview may terminate." And turning to the Marquis, she took his arm again. "My son," she said, "say something." M. de Bellegarde looked down at his mother, passing his hand over his forehead, and then, tenderly, caressingly, "What shall I say?" he asked. "There is only one thing to say," said the Marquise, "that it was really not worth while to have interrupted our walk." But the Marquis thought he could improve this. "Your papers are forgery," he said to Newman. Newman shook his head a little, with a tranquil smile. "Monsieur de Bellegarde," he said, "your mother does better. She has done better all along, from the first of my knowing you. You're a mighty plucky woman, madam," he continued. "It's a great pity you have made me your enemy. I should have been one of your greatest admirers." "Mon pauvre ami," said Madame de Bellegarde to her son in French, and as if she had not heard these words, "you must take me immediately to my carriage." Newman stepped back and let them leave him. He watched them a moment and saw Madame Urbain with her little girl come out of a by-path to meet them. The old lady stooped and kissed her grandchild. "Damn it, she is plucky," said Newman, and then he walked home with a slight sense of being balked. She was so inexpressibly defiant. But on reflection he decided that what he had witnessed was no real sense of security, still less a real innocence. It was only a very superior style of brazen assurance. "Wait till she reads the paper," he said to himself, and he concluded that he should hear from her soon. He heard sooner than he expected. The next morning, before midday, when he was about to give orders for his breakfast to be served, M. de Bellegarde's card was brought to him. "She has read the paper, and she has passed a bad night," said Newman. He instantly admitted his visitor, who came in with the air of an ambassador of a great power meeting the delegate of a barbarous tribe whom an absurd accident had enabled for the moment to be abominably annoying. The ambassador, at all events, had passed a bad night, and his faultlessly careful toilet only threw into relief the frigid rancor in his eyes and the mottled tones of his refined complexion. He stood before Newman a moment, breathing quickly and softly, and shaking his forefinger curtly as his host pointed to a chair. "What I have come to say is soon said," he declared, "and can only be said without ceremony." "I am good for as much or for as little as you desire," said Newman. The Marquis looked round the room, and then, "On what terms will you part with your scrap of paper?" "On none." And while Newman, with his head on one side and his hands behind him, sounded the Marquis's turbid gaze with his own, he added, "Certainly that is not worth sitting down about." M. de Bellegarde meditated a moment, as if he had not heard Newman's refusal. "My mother and I, last evening," he said, "talked over your story. You will be surprised to learn that we think your little document is and he held back his word a moment, is genuine." "You forget that with you I am used to surprises," exclaimed Newman with a laugh. "The very smallest amount of respect that we owe to my father's memory," the Marquis continued, "makes us desire that he should not be held up to the world as the author of so infernal attack upon the reputation of a wife whose only fault was that she had been submissive to accumulated injury." "Oh, I see," said Newman. "It's for your father's sake." And he laughed the laugh in which he indulged when he was most amused, a noiseless laugh with his lips closed. But M. de Bellegarde's gravity held good. "There are a few of my father's particular friends for whom the knowledge of so unfortunate an inspiration would be a real grief. Even say we firmly established by medical evidence the presumption of a mind disordered by fever. Il en resterait quelque chose. At the best it would look ill in him, very ill." "Don't try medical evidence," said Newman. "Don't touch the doctors, and they won't touch you. I don't mind your knowing that I have not written to them." Newman fancied that he saw signs in M. de Bellegarde's discolored mask that this information was extremely pertinent. But it may have been merely fancy, for the Marquis remained majestically argumentative. "For instance, Madame d'Outreville," he said, "of whom you spoke yesterday. I can imagine nothing that would shock her more." "Oh, I am quite prepared to shock Madame d'Outreville, you know. That's on the cards. I expect to shock a great many people." M. de Bellegarde examined for a moment the stitching on the back of one of his gloves. Then, without looking up, "We don't offer you money," he said. "That we suppose to be useless." Newman, turning away, took a few turns about the room and then came back. "What do you offer me? By what I can make out, the generosity is all to be on my side." The Marquis dropped his arms at his side and held his head a little higher. "What we offer you is a chance that a gentleman should appreciate. A chance to abstain from inflicting a terrible blot upon the memory of a man who certainly had his faults, but who, personally, had done you no wrong." "There are two things to say to that," said Newman. "The first is, as regards appreciating your chance, that you don't consider me a gentleman. That's your great point, you know. It's a poor rule that won't work both ways. The second is that, well, in a word, you are talking great nonsense." Newman, who in the midst of his bitterness had, as I have said, kept well before his eyes a certain ideal of saying nothing rude, was immediately somewhat regretfully conscious of the sharpness of these words. But he speedily observed that the Marquis took them more quietly than might have been expected. M. de Bellegarde, like the stately ambassador that he was, continued the policy of ignoring what was disagreeable in his adversary's replies. He gazed at the gilded arabesques on the opposite wall, and then presently transferred his glance to Newman, as if he too were a large grotesque in a rather vulgar system of chamber decoration. "I suppose you know that as regards yourself it won't do at all." "How do you mean it won't do?" "Why, of course you damn yourself. But I suppose that's in your program. You propose to throw mud at us. You believe, you hope that some of it may stick. We know, of course, it can't," explained the Marquis in a tone of conscious lucidity. "But you take the chance and are willing at any rate to show that you yourself have dirty hands." "That's a good comparison. At least half of it is," said Newman. "I take the chance of something sticking. But as regards my hands, they are clean. I have taken the matter up with my finger-tips." M. de Bellegarde looked a moment into his hat. "All our friends are quite with us," he said. "They would have done exactly as we have done." "I shall believe that when I hear them say it. Meanwhile I shall think better of human nature." The Marquis looked into his hat again. "Madame de Cintré was extremely fond of her father. If she knew of the existence of the few written words of which you propose to make this scandalous use, she would demand of you proudly for his sake to give it up to her, and she would destroy it without reading it." "Very possibly," Newman rejoined, "but she will not know. I was in that convent yesterday, and I know what she is doing. Lord deliver us! You can guess whether it made me feel forgiving." M. de Bellegarde appeared to have nothing more to suggest, but he continued to stand there, rigid and elegant, as a man who believed that his mere personal presence had an argumentative value. Newman watched him, and without yielding an inch on the main issue, felt an incongruously good-natured impulse to help him to retreat in good order. "Your visit's a failure, you see," he said. "You offer too little." "Propose something yourself," said the Marquis. "Give me back Madame de Cintré in the same state in which you took her from me." M. de Bellegarde threw back his head, and his pale face flushed. "Never," he said. "You can't." "We wouldn't if we could. In the sentiment which led us to deprecate her marriage, nothing has changed." "Deprecate is good!" cried Newman. "It was hardly worth while to come here only to tell me that you were not ashamed of yourselves. I could have guessed that." The Marquis slowly walked toward the door, and Newman, following it, opened it for him. "What you propose to do will be very disagreeable," M. de Bellegarde said. "That is very evident. But it will be nothing more." "As I understand it," Newman answered, "that will be quite enough." M. de Bellegarde stood for a moment looking on the ground, as if he were ransacking his ingenuity to see what else he could do to save his father's reputation. Then, with a little cold sigh, he seemed to signify that he regretfully surrendered the late Marquis to the penalty of his turpitude. He gave a hardly perceptible shrug, took his neat umbrella from the servant in the vestibule, and with his gentlemanly walk passed out. Newman stood listening till he heard the door close. Then he slowly exclaimed, "Well, I ought to begin to be satisfied now." Chapter 25 of The American. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American, by Henry James, Chapter 25. Newman called upon the comical Duchess and found her at home. An old gentleman with a high nose and a gold-headed cane was just taking leave of her. He made Newman a protracted obeisance as he retired, and our hero supposed that he was one of the mysterious grandees with whom he had shaken hands at Madame de Bellegarde's ball. The Duchess, in her armchair, from which she did not move, with a great flower-pot on one side of her, a pile of pink-covered novels on the other, and a large piece of tapestry depending from her lap, presented an expansive and imposing front, but her aspect was in the highest degree gracious, and there was nothing in her manner to check the effusion of his confidence. She talked to him about flowers and books, getting launched with marvelous promptitude, about the theaters, about the peculiar institutions of his native country, about the humidity of Paris, about the pretty complexions of the American ladies, about his impressions of France and his opinion of its female inhabitants. All this was a brilliant monologue on the part of the Duchess, who, like many of her countrywomen, was a person of an affirmative rather than an interrogative cast of mind, who made mots and put them herself into circulation, and who was apt to offer you a present of a convenient little opinion neatly enveloped in the gilt paper of a happy Gallicism. Newman had come to her with a grievance, but he found himself in an atmosphere in which apparently no cognizance was taken of grievance, an atmosphere into which the chill of discomfort had never penetrated, and which seemed exclusively made up of mild, sweet, stale intellectual perfumes. The feeling with which he had watched Madame d'Outreville at the treacherous festival of the Bellegarde came back to him. She struck him as a wonderful old lady in a comedy, particularly well up in her part. He observed before long that she asked him no questions about their common friends, she made no allusion to the circumstances under which he had been presented to her. She neither feigned ignorance of a change in these circumstances, nor pretended to condole with him upon it, but she smiled and discoursed and compared the tender-tinted wools of her tapestry, as if the Bellegardes and their wickedness were not of this world. "She is fighting shy," said Newman to himself, and having made the observation, he was prompted to observe, farther, how the Duchess would carry off her indifference. She did so in a masterly manner. There was not a gleam of disguised consciousness in those small, clear, demonstrative eyes, which constituted her nearest claim to personal loveliness. There was not a symptom of apprehension that Newman would trench upon the ground she proposed to avoid. "Upon my word, she does it very well," he tacitly commented. "They all hold together bravely, and whether anyone else can trust them or not, they can certainly trust each other." Newman, at this juncture, fell to admiring the Duchess for her fine manners. He felt, most accurately, that she was not a grain less urbane than she would have been if his marriage was still in prospect, but he felt also that she was not a particle more urbane. He had come, so reasoned the Duchess. Heaven knew why he had come, after what had happened, and for the half hour, therefore, she would be charmante, but she would never see him again. Finding no ready-made opportunity to tell his story, Newman pondered these things more dispassionately than might have been expected. He stretched his legs as usual, and even chuckled a little, appreciatively and noiselessly. And then, as the Duchess went on relating a mot with which her mother had snubbed the great Napoleon, it occurred to Newman that her evasion of a chapter of French history more interesting to himself might possibly be the result of an extreme consideration for his feelings. Perhaps it was delicacy on the Duchess's part, not policy. He was on the point of saying something himself to make the chance which he had determined to give her still better, when the servant announced another visitor. The Duchess, on hearing the name, it was that of an Italian prince, gave a little imperceptible pout, and said to Newman rapidly, "I beg you to remain. I desire this visit to be short." Newman said to himself, at this, that Madame d'Outreville intended, after all, that they should discuss the Bellegardes together. The prince was a short, stout man, with a head disproportionately large. He had a dusky complexion and a bushy eyebrow, beneath which his eye wore a fixed and somewhat defiant expression. He seemed to be challenging you to insinuate that he was top-heavy. The Duchess, judging from her charge to Newman, regarded him as a bore, but this was not apparent from the unchecked flow of her conversation. She made a fresh series of mots, characterized with great felicity the Italian intellect and the taste of the figs at Sorrento, predicted the ultimate future of the Italian kingdom, disgust with the brutal Sardinian rule, and complete reversion throughout the peninsula to the sacred sway of the Holy Father, and finally gave a history of the love affairs of the Princess X. This narrative provoked some rectifications on the part of the prince, who, as he said, pretended to know something about that matter, and having satisfied himself that Newman was in no laughing mood, either with regard to the size of his head or anything else, he entered into the controversy with an animation for which the Duchess, when she set him down as a bore, could not have been prepared. The sentimental vicissitudes of the Princess X led to a discussion of the heart history of Florentine nobility in general. The Duchess had spent 5 weeks in Florence and had gathered much information on the subject. This was merged, in turn, in an examination of the Italian heart per se. The Duchess took a brilliantly heterodox view, thought it the least susceptible organ of its kind that she had ever encountered, related examples of its want of susceptibility, and at last declared that for her the Italians were a people of ice. The prince became flame to refute her, and his visit really proved charming. Newman was naturally out of the conversation. He sat with his head a little on one side, watching the interlocutors. The Duchess, as she talked, frequently looked at him with a smile, as if to intimate, in the charming manner of her nation, that it lay only with him to say something very much to the point. But he said nothing at all, and at last his thoughts began to wander. A singular feeling came over him, a sudden sense of the folly of his errand. What under the sun had he to say to the Duchess, after all? Wherein would it profit him to tell her that the Bellegardes were traitors, and that the old lady, into the bargain, was a murderess? He seemed morally to have turned a sort of somersault, and to find things looking differently in consequence. He felt a sudden stiffening of his will and quickening of his reserve. What in the world had he been thinking of when he fancied the Duchess could help him, and that it would conduce to his comfort to make her think ill of the Bellegardes? What did her opinion of the Bellegardes matter to him? It was only a shade more important than the opinion the Bellegardes entertained of her. The Duchess help him? That cold, stout, soft, artificial woman help him? She who in the last 20 minutes had built up between them a wall of polite conversation in which she evidently flattered herself that he would never find a gate. Had it come to that he was asking favors of conceited people, and appealing for sympathy where he had no sympathy to give? He rested his arms on his knees, and sat for some minutes staring into his hat. As he did so, his ears tingled. He had come very near being an ass. Whether or no the Duchess would hear his story, he wouldn't tell it. Was he to sit there another half-hour for the sake of exposing the Bellegardes? The Bellegardes be hanged! He got up abruptly and advanced to shake hands with his hostess. "You can't stay longer?" she asked very graciously. "I am afraid not," he said. She hesitated a moment, and then, "I had an idea you had something particular to say to me," she declared. Newman looked at her. He felt a little dizzy. For the moment he seemed to be turning his somersault again. The little Italian prince came to his help. "Ah, madam, who has not that?" he softly sighed. "Don't teach Mr. Newman to say fadaises," said the Duchess. "It is his merit that he doesn't know how." "Yes, I don't know how to say fadaises," said Newman, "and I don't want to say anything unpleasant." "I am sure you are very considerate," said the Duchess with a smile, and she gave him a little nod for good-bye with which he took his departure. Once in the street, he stood for some time on the pavement, wondering whether, after all, he was not an ass not to have discharged his pistol. And then again he decided that to talk to anyone whomsoever about the Bellegardes would be extremely disagreeable to him. The least disagreeable thing, under the circumstances, was to banish them from his mind and never think of them again. Indecision had not hitherto been one of Newman's weaknesses, but in this case it was not of long duration. For 3 days after this he did not, or at least he tried not to, think of the Bellegardes. He dined with Mrs. Tristram, and on her mentioning their name he begged her almost severely to desist. This gave Tom Tristram a much coveted opportunity to offer his condolences. "The fact is, my dear fellow, you see, that you ought never to have gone into it. It was not your doing, I know. It was all my wife. If you want to come down on her, I'll stand off. I give you leave to hit her as hard as you like. You know she has never had a word of reproach from me in her life, and I think she is in need of something of the kind. Why didn't you listen to me? You know I didn't believe in the thing. I thought it at best an amiable decision. I don't profess to be a Don Juan or a gay Lothario, that class of man, you know, but I do pretend to know something about the harder sex. I have never disliked a woman in my life that she has not turned out badly. I was not at all deceived in Lizzie, for instance. I always had my doubts about her. Whatever you may think of my present situation, I must at least admit that I got into it with my eyes open. Now, suppose you had got into something like this box with Madame de Cintré. You may depend upon it she would have turned out a stiff one. And upon my word, I don't see where you could have found your comfort." "Not from the Marquis, my dear Newman. He wasn't a man you could go and talk things over with in a sociable, common-sense way. Did he ever seem to want to have you on the premises? Did he ever try to see you alone? Did he ever ask you to come and smoke a cigar with him of an evening, or step in, when you had been calling on the ladies, and take something? I don't think you would have got much encouragement out of him. And as for the old lady, she struck one as an uncommonly strong dose. They have a great expression here, you know. They call it sympathique. Everything is sympathetic, or ought to be. Now, Madame de Bellegarde is about as sympathetic as that mustard pot. They're a cold-blooded lot, anyway. I felt it awfully at that ball of theirs. I felt as if I were walking up and down in the Armory in the Tower of London. My dear boy, don't think me a vulgar brute for hinting at it, but you may depend upon it, all they wanted was your money. I know something about that. I can tell when people want one's money. Why they stopped wanting yours, I don't know. I suppose because they could get someone else's without working so hard for it. It isn't worth finding out. It may be that it was not Madame de Cintré that backed out first. Very likely the old woman put her up to it. I suspect she and her mother are really as thick as thieves, eh? You are well out of it, my boy. Make up your mind to that. If I express myself strongly, it is all because I love you so much. And from that point of view, I may say, I should as soon have thought of making up to that piece of pale high-mightiness as I should have thought of making up to the obelisk in the Place de la Concorde. Newman sat gazing at Tristram during this harangue with a lack-lustre eye. Never yet had he seemed to himself to have outgrown so completely the phase of equal comradeship with Tom Tristram. Mrs. Tristram's glance at her husband had more of a spark. She turned to Newman with a slightly lurid smile. "You must at least do justice," she said, "to the felicity with which Mr. Tristram repairs the indiscretions of a too zealous wife." But even without the aid of Tom Tristram's conversational felicities, Newman would have begun to think of the Bellegardes again. He could cease to think of them only when he ceased to think of his loss and privation, and the days had as yet but scantily lightened the weight of this incommodity. In vain Mrs. Tristram begged him to cheer up. She assured him that the sight of his countenance made her miserable. "How can I help it?" he demanded with a trembling voice. "I feel like a widower, and a widower who has not even the consolation of going to stand beside the grave of his wife, who has not the right to wear so much mourning as a weed in his hat. I feel," he added in a moment, "as if my wife had been murdered and her assassins were still at large." Mrs. Tristram made no immediate rejoinder, but at last she said, with a smile which, in so far as it was a forced one, was less successfully simulated than such smiles on her lips usually were, "Are you very sure that you would have been happy?" Newman stared a moment and then shook his head. "That's weak," he said. "That won't do." "Well," said Mrs. Tristram with a more triumphant bravery, "I don't believe you would have been happy." Newman gave a little laugh. "Say I should have been miserable then. It's a misery I should have preferred to any happiness." Mrs. Tristram began to muse. "I should have been curious to see. It would have been very strange." "Was it from curiosity that you urged me to try to marry her?" "A little," said Mrs. Tristram, growing still more audacious. Newman gave her the one angry look he had been destined ever to give her, turned away and took up his hat. She watched him a moment, and then she said, "That sounds very cruel, but it is less so than it sounds. Curiosity has a share in almost everything I do. I wanted very much to see, first, whether such a marriage could actually take place; second, what would happen if it should take place." "So you didn't believe," said Newman resentfully. "Yes, I believed. I believed that it would take place, and that you would be happy. Otherwise I should have been, among my speculations, a very heartless creature. But," she continued, laying her hand upon Newman's arm and hazarding a grave smile, "it was the highest flight ever taken by a tolerably bold imagination." Shortly after this she recommended him to leave Paris and to travel for 3 months. Change of scene would do him good, and he would forget his misfortune sooner in absence from the objects which had witnessed it. "I really feel," Newman rejoined, "as if to leave you, at least, would do me good, and cost me very little effort. You are growing cynical. You shock me and pain me." "Very good," said Mrs. Tristram, good-naturedly or cynically, as may be thought most probable. "I shall certainly see you again." Newman was very willing to get away from Paris. The brilliant streets he had walked through in his happier hours, and which then seemed to wear a higher brilliancy in honor of his happiness, appeared now to be in the secret of his defeat, and to look down upon it in shining mockery. He would go somewhere, he cared little where, and he made his preparations. Then one morning, at haphazard, he drove to the train that would transport him to Boulogne and dispatch him thence to the shores of Britain. As he rolled along in the train he asked himself what had become of his revenge, and he was able to say that it was provisionally pigeon-holed in a very safe place. It would keep till called for. He arrived in London in the midst of what is called the season, and it seemed to him at first that he might here put himself in the way of being diverted from his heavy-heartedness. He knew no one in all England, but the spectacle of the mighty metropolis roused him somewhat from his apathy. Anything that was enormous usually found favor with Newman, and the multitudinous energies and industries of England stirred within him a dull vivacity of contemplation. It is on record that the weather, at that moment, was of the finest English quality. He took long walks and explored London in every direction. He sat by the hour in Kensington Gardens and beside the adjoining drive, watching the people and the horses and the carriages, the rosy English beauties, the wonderful English dandies, and the splendid flunkeys. He went to the opera and found it better than Paris. He went to the theater and found a surprising charm in listening to dialogue, the finest points of which came within the range of his comprehension. He made several excursions into the country, recommended by the waiter at his hotel, with whom, on this and similar points, he had established confidential relations. He watched the deer in Windsor Forest, and admired the Thames from Richmond Hill. He ate whitebait and brown bread and butter at Greenwich, and strolled in the grassy shadow of the Cathedral of Canterbury. He also visited the Tower of London and Madame Tussaud's exhibition. One day he thought he would go to Sheffield, and then, thinking again, he gave it up. Why should he go to Sheffield? He had a feeling that the link which bound him to a possible interest in the manufacture of cutlery was broken. He had no desire for an inside view of any successful enterprise whatever, and he would not have given the smallest sum for the privilege of talking over the details of the most splendid business with the shrewdest of overseers. One afternoon he had walked into Hyde Park, and was slowly threading his way through the human maze which edges the drive. The stream of carriages was no less dense, and Newman, as usual, marveled at the strange, dingy figures which he saw taking the air in some of the stateliest vehicles. They reminded him of what he had read of Eastern and Southern countries, in which grotesque idols and fetishes were sometimes taken out of their temples and carried abroad in golden chariots to be displayed to the multitude. He saw a great many pretty cheeks beneath high-plumed hats as he squeezed his way through serried waves of crumpled muslin, and sitting on little chairs at the base of the great serious English trees, he observed a number of quiet-eyed maidens who seemed only to remind him afresh that the magic of beauty had gone out of the world with Madame de Cintré, to say nothing of other damsels whose eyes were not quiet, and who struck him still more as a satire on possible consolation. He had been walking for some time when, directly in front of him, borne back by the summer breeze, he heard a few words uttered in that bright Parisian idiom from which his ears had begun to alienate themselves. The voice in which the words were spoken made them seem even more like a thing with which he had once been familiar, and as he bent his eyes it lent an identity to the commonplace elegance of the black hair and shoulders of a young lady walking in the same direction as himself. Mademoiselle Nioche, apparently, had come to seek a more rapid advancement in London, and another glance led Newman to suppose that she had found it. A gentleman was strolling beside her, lending a most attentive ear to her conversation, and too entranced to open his lips. Newman did not hear his voice, but perceived that he presented the dorsal expression of a well-dressed Englishman. Mademoiselle Nioche was attracting attention. The ladies who passed her turned around to survey the Parisian perfection of her toilet. A great cataract of flounces rolled down from the young lady's waist to Newman's feet. He had to step aside to avoid treading on them. He stepped aside, indeed, with a decision of movement which the occasion scarcely demanded, for even this imperfect glimpse of Miss Noémie had excited his displeasure. She seemed an odious blot upon the face of nature. He wanted to put her out of his sight. He thought of Valentin de Bellegarde, still green in the earth of his burial, his young life clipped by this flourishing impudence. The perfume of the young lady's finery sickened him. He turned his head and tried to deflect his course, but the pressure of the crowd kept him near her a few minutes longer, so that he heard what she was saying. "Ah, I am sure he will miss me," she murmured. "It was very cruel in me to leave him. I am afraid you will think me a very heartless creature. He might perfectly well have come with us. I don't think he is very well," she added. "It seemed to me to-day that he was not very gay." Newman wondered whom she was talking about, but just then an opening among his neighbors enabled him to turn away, and he said to himself that she was probably paying a tribute to British propriety and playing a tender solicitude about her papa. Was that miserable old man still treading the path of vice in her train? Was he still giving her the benefit of his experience of affairs, and had he crossed the sea to serve as her interpreter? Newman walked some distance farther, and then began to retrace his steps, taking care not to traverse again the orbit of Mademoiselle Nioche. At last he looked for a chair under the trees, but he had some difficulty in finding an empty one. He was about to give up the search when he saw a gentleman rise from the seat he had been occupying, leaving Newman to take it without looking at his neighbors. He sat there for some time without heeding them. His attention was lost in the irritation and bitterness produced by his recent glimpse of Miss Noémie's iniquitous vitality. But at the end of a quarter of an hour, dropping his eyes, he perceived a small pug-dog squatted upon the path near his feet, a diminutive but very perfect specimen of its interesting species. The pug was sniffing at the fashionable world as it passed him, with his little black muzzle, and was kept from extending his investigation by a large blue ribbon attached to his collar with an enormous rosette and held in the hand of a person seated next to Newman. To this person Newman transferred his attention, and immediately perceived that he was the object of all that of his neighbor, who was staring up at him from a pair of little fixed white eyes. These eyes Newman instantly recognized. He had been sitting for the last quarter of an hour beside Monsieur Nioche. He had vaguely felt that someone was staring at him. Monsieur Nioche continued to stare. He appeared afraid to move, even to the extent of evading Newman's glance. "Dear me," said Newman, "are you here too?" And he looked at his neighbor's helplessness more grimly than he knew. Monsieur Nioche had a new hat and a pair of kid gloves. His clothes, too, seemed to belong to a more recent antiquity than of yore. Over his arm was suspended a lady's mantilla, a light and brilliant tissue fringed with white lace, which had apparently been committed to his keeping, and the little dog's blue ribbon was wound tightly round his hand. There was no expression of recognition in his face, or of anything, indeed, save a sort of feeble, fascinated dread. Newman looked at the pug and the lace mantilla, and then he met the old man's eyes again. "You know me, I see," he pursued. "You might have spoken to me before." M. Nioche still said nothing, but it seemed to Newman that his eyes began faintly to water. "I didn't expect," our hero went on, "to meet you so far from the Café de la Patrie." The old man remained silent, but decidedly Newman had touched the source of tears. His neighbor sat staring, and Newman added, "What's the matter, Monsieur Nioche? You used to talk very prettily. Don't you remember you even gave me lessons in conversation?" At this Monsieur Nioche decided to change his attitude. He stooped and picked up the pug, lifted it to his face, and wiped his eyes on its little soft back. "I'm afraid to speak to you," he presently said, looking over the puppy's shoulder. "I hoped you wouldn't notice me. I should have moved away, but I was afraid that if I moved you would notice me, so I sat very still." "I suspect you have a bad conscience, sir," said Newman. The old man put down the little dog and held it carefully in his lap. Then he shook his head, with his eyes still fixed upon his interlocutor. "No, Mr. Newman, I have a good conscience," he murmured. "Then why should you want to slink away from me?" Because you don't understand my position." "Oh, I think you once explained it to me," said Newman, "but it seems improved." "Improved!" exclaimed M. Nioche under his breath. "Do you call this improvement?" And he glanced at the treasures in his arms. "Why, you are on your travels," Newman rejoined. "A visit to London in the season is certainly a sign of prosperity." M. Nioche, in answer to this cruel piece of irony, lifted the puppy up to his face again, peering at Newman with his small blank eye-holes. There was something almost imbecile in the movement, and Newman hardly knew whether he was taking refuge in a convenient affectation of unreason, or whether he had in fact paid for his dishonor by the loss of his wits. In the latter case, just now, he felt a little more tenderly to the foolish old man than in the former. Responsible or not, he was equally an accomplice of his detestably mischievous daughter. Newman was going to leave him abruptly when a ray of entreaty appeared to disengage itself from the old man's misty gaze. "Are you going away?" he asked. "Do you want me to stay?" said Newman. "I should have left you, from consideration, but my dignity suffers at your leaving me that way." "Have you got anything particular to say to me?" M. Nioche looked around at him to see that no one was listening, and then he said very softly, but distinctly, "I have not forgiven her." Newman gave a short laugh, but the old man seemed for the moment not to perceive it. He was gazing away absently at some metaphysical image of his implacability. "It doesn't much matter whether you forgive her or not," said Newman. "There are other people who won't, I assure you." "What has she done?" M. Nioche softly questioned, turning round again. "I don't know what she does, you know." "She has done a devilish mischief. It doesn't matter what," said Newman. "She's a nuisance. She ought to be stopped." M. Nioche stealthily put out his hand and laid it very gently upon Newman's arm. "Stopped, yes," he whispered. "That's it. Stopped short. She is running away. She must be stopped." Then he paused a moment and looked around him. "I mean to stop her," he went on. "I am only waiting for my chance." "I see," said Newman, laughing briefly again. "She is running away, and you are running after her. You have run a long distance." But M. Nioche stared insistently. "I shall stop her," he softly repeated. He had hardly spoken when the crowd in front of them separated, as if by the impulse to make way for an important personage. Presently through the opening advanced Mademoiselle Nioche, attended by the gentleman whom Newman had lately observed. His face being now presented to our hero, the latter recognized the irregular features, the hardly more regular complexion, and the amiable expression of Lord Deepmere. Noémie, on finding herself suddenly confronted with Newman, who, like M. Nioche, had risen from his seat, faltered for a barely perceptible instant. She gave him a little nod, as if she had seen him yesterday, and then with a good-natured smile, "Tiens, how we keep meeting," she said. She looked consummately pretty, and the front of her dress was a wonderful work of art. She went up to her father, stretching out her hands for the little dog, which he submissively placed in them, and she began to kiss it and murmur over it. "To think of leaving him all alone! What a wicked, abominable creature he must believe me! He has been very unwell," she added, turning and affecting to explain to Newman, with a spark of infernal impudence, fine as a needle-point, in her eye. "I don't think the English climate agrees with him." "It seems to agree wonderfully with his mistress," said Newman. "Do you mean me? I have never been better, thank you," Miss Noémie declared. "But with milord," and she gave a brilliant glance at her late companion, "how can one help being well?" She seated herself in the chair from which her father had risen, and began to arrange the little dog's rosette. Lord Deepmere carried off such embarrassment as might be incidental to this unexpected encounter with the inferior grace of a male and a Briton. He blushed a good deal, and greeted the object of his late momentary aspiration to rivalry in the favor of a person other than the mistress of the invalid pug, with an awkward nod and a rapid ejaculation, an ejaculation to which Newman, who often found it hard to understand the speech of English people, was able to attach no meaning. Then the young man stood there, with his hand on his hip, and with a conscious grin, staring askance at Miss Noémie. Suddenly an idea seemed to strike him, and he said, turning to Newman, "Oh, you know her?" "Yes," said Newman, "I know her. I don't believe you do." "Oh, dear, yes, I do," said Lord Deepmere, with another grin. "I knew her in Paris. By my poor cousin Bellegarde, you know. He knew her, poor fellow, didn't he? It was she, you know, who was at the bottom of his affair. Awfully sad, wasn't it?" continued the young man, talking off his embarrassment as his simple nature permitted. "They got up some story about its being for the Pope, about the other man having said something against the Pope's morals. They always do that, you know. They put it on the Pope because Bellegarde was once in the Zouave. But it was about her morals. She was the Pope," Lord Deepmere pursued, directing an eye illumined by this pleasantry towards Mademoiselle Nioche, who was bending gracefully over her lap-dog, apparently absorbed in conversation with it. "I dare say you think it rather odd that I should—keep up the acquaintance," the young man resumed. "But she couldn't help it, you know, and Bellegarde was only my 20th cousin. I dare say you think it's rather cheeky, my showing with her in Hyde Park. But you see, she isn't known yet, and she's in such very good form." And Lord Deepmere's conclusion was lost in the attesting glance which he again directed toward the young lady. Newman turned away. He was having more of her than he relished. M. Nioche had stepped aside on his daughter's approach, and he stood there, within a very small compass, looking down hard at the ground. It had never yet, as between him and Newman, been so apposite to place on record the fact that he had not forgiven his daughter. As Newman was moving away he looked up and drew near to him, and Newman, seeing the old man had something particular to say, bent his head for an instant. "You will see it some day in the papers," murmured M. Nioche. Our hero departed to hide his smile, and to this day, though the newspapers form his principal reading, his eyes have not been arrested by any paragraph forming a sequel to this announcement. Chapter 26 of The American. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American by Henry James, Chapter 26. In that uninitiated observation of the great spectacle of English life upon which I have touched, it might be supposed that Newman passed a great many dull days. But the dullness of his days pleased him. His melancholy, which was settling into a secondary stage, like a healing wound, had in it a certain acrid, palatable sweetness. He had company in his thoughts, and for the present he wanted no other. He had no desire to make acquaintances, and he left untouched a couple of notes of introduction which had been sent him by Tom Tristram. He thought a great deal of Madame de Cintré, sometimes with a dogged tranquillity which might have seemed, for a quarter of an hour at a time, a near neighbor to forgetfulness. He lived over again the happiest hours he had known, that silver chain of numbered days in which his afternoon visits, tending sensibly to the ideal result, had subtilized his good humor to a sort of spiritual intoxication. He came back to reality after such reveries with a somewhat muffled shock. He had begun to feel the need of accepting the unchangeable. At other times the reality became an infamy again, and the unchangeable an imposture, and he gave himself up to his angry restlessness till he was weary. But on the whole he fell into a rather reflective mood. Without in the least intending it or knowing it, he attempted to read the moral of his strange misadventure. He asked himself in his quieter hours whether perhaps after all he was more commercial than was pleasant. We know that it was in obedience to a strong reaction against questions exclusively commercial that he had come out to pick up aesthetic entertainment in Europe. It may therefore be understood that he was able to conceive that a man might be too commercial. He was very willing to grant it, but the concession, as to his own case, was not made with any very oppressive sense of shame. If he had been too commercial, he was ready to forget it, for in being so he had done no man any wrong that might not be as easily forgotten. He reflected with sober placidity that at least there were no monuments of his meanness scattered about the world. If there was any reason in the nature of things why his connection with business should have cast a shadow upon a connection, even a connection broken, with a woman justly proud, he was willing to sponge it out of his life forever. The thing seemed a possibility. He could not feel it, doubtless, as keenly as some people, and it hardly seemed worth while to flap his wings very hard to rise to the idea. But he could feel it enough to make any sacrifice that still remained to be made. As to what such sacrifice was now to be made to, here Newman stopped short before a blank wall, over which there sometimes played a shadowy imagery. He had a fancy of carrying out his life as he would have directed it if Madame de Cintré had been left to him, of making it a religion to do nothing that she would have disliked. In this, certainly, there was no sacrifice, but there was a pale, oblique ray of inspiration. It would be lonely entertainment, a good deal like a man talking to himself in the mirror for want of better company. Yet the idea yielded Newman several half-hours' dumb exaltation as he sat, with his hands in his pockets and his legs stretched, over the relics of an expensively poor dinner, in the undying English twilight. If, however, his commercial imagination was dead, he felt no contempt for the surviving actualities begotten by it. He was glad he had been prosperous and had been a great man of business rather than a small one. He was extremely glad he was rich. He felt no impulse to sell all he had and give to the poor, or to retire into meditative economy and asceticism. He was glad he was rich and tolerably young. It was possible to think too much about buying and selling. It was a gain to have a good slice of life left in which not to think about them. Come, what should he think about now? Again and again Newman could think only of one thing. His thoughts always came back to it, and as they did so with an emotional rush which seemed physically to express itself in a sudden upward choking, he leaned forward, the waiter having left the room, and resting his arms on the table, buried his troubled face. He remained in England till midsummer, and spent a month in the country, wandering about cathedrals, castles, and ruins. Several times, taking a walk from his inn into meadows and parks, he stopped by a well-worn stile, looked across through the early evening at a grey church tower, with its dusky nimbus of thick circling swallows, and remembered that this might have been part of the entertainment of his honeymoon. He had never been so much alone, or indulged so little in accidental dialogue. The period of recreation appointed by Mrs. Tristram had at last expired, and he asked himself what he should do now. Mrs. Tristram had written to him, proposing to him that he should join her in the Pyrenees, but he was not in the humour to return to France. The simplest thing was to repair to Liverpool and embark on the first American steamer. Newman made his way to the great seaport and secured his berth, and the night before sailing he sat in his room at the hotel, staring down vacantly and wearily at an open portmanteau. A number of papers were lying upon it, which he had been meaning to look over. Some of them might conveniently be destroyed, but at last he shuffled them roughly together and pushed them into a corner of the valise. They were business papers, and he was in no humour for sifting them. Then he drew forth his pocket-book and took out a paper of smaller size than those he had dismissed. He did not unfold it. He simply sat looking at the back of it. If he had momentarily entered the idea of destroying it, the idea quickly expired. What the paper suggested was the feeling that lay in his innermost heart, and that no reviving cheerfulness could long quench, the feeling that after all, and above all, he was a good fellow wronged. With it came a hearty hope that the Bellegardes were enjoying their suspense as to what he would do yet. The more it was prolonged, the more they would enjoy it. He had hung fire once, yes. Perhaps in his present queer state of mind he might hang fire again. But he restored the little paper to his pocket-book very tenderly, and felt better for thinking of the suspense of the Bellegardes. He felt better every time he thought of it after that, as he sailed the summer seas. He landed in New York and journeyed across the continent to San Francisco, and nothing that he observed by the way contributed to mitigate his sense of being a good fellow wronged. He saw a great many other good fellows, his old friends, but he told none of them of the trick that had been played on him. He said simply that the lady he was to have married had changed her mind, and when he was asked if he had changed his own, he said, "Suppose we change the subject." He told his friends that he had brought home no new ideas from Europe, and his conduct probably struck them as an eloquent proof of failing invention. He took no interest in chatting about his affairs, and manifested no desire to look over his accounts. He asked half a dozen questions which, like those of an eminent physician inquiring for particular symptoms, showed that he still knew what he was talking about, but he made no comments and gave no directions. He not only puzzled the gentleman on the Stock Exchange, but he was himself surprised at the extent of his indifference. As it seemed only to increase, he made an effort to combat it. He tried to interest himself and to take up his old occupations, but they appeared unreal to him. Do what he would, he somehow could not believe in them. Sometimes he began to fear that there was something the matter with his head, that his brain perhaps had softened, and that the end of his strong activities had come. This idea came back to him with an exasperating force. A hopeless, helpless loafer, useful to no one and detestable to himself, This was what the treachery of the Bellegarde had made of him. In his restless idleness he came back from San Francisco to New York, and sat for 3 days in the lobby of his hotel, looking out through a huge wall of plate glass at the unceasing stream of pretty girls in Parisian-looking dresses, undulating past with little parcels nursed against their neat figures. At the end of 3 days he returned to San Francisco, and having arrived there, he wished he had stayed away. He had nothing to do, his occupation was gone, and it seemed to him that he should never find it again. He had nothing to do here, he sometimes said to himself, but there was something beyond the ocean that he was still to do, something that he had left undone experimentally and speculatively to see if it could content itself to remain undone. But it was not content. It kept pulling at his heartstrings and thumping at his reason. It murmured in his ears and hovered perpetually before his eyes. It interposed between all new resolutions and their fulfillment. It seemed like a stubborn ghost, dumbly entreating to be laid. Till that was done, he should never be able to do anything else. One day, toward the end of the winter, after a long interval, he received a letter from Mrs. Tristram, who apparently was animated by a charitable desire to amuse and distract her correspondent. She gave him much Paris gossip, talked of General Packard and Miss Kitty Upjohn, enumerated the new plays at the theater, and enclosed a note from her husband, who had gone down to spend a month at Nice. Then came her signature, and after this her postscript. The letter consisted of these few lines: I heard 3 days since from my friend, the Abbé Aubert, that Madame de Cintré last week took the veil at the Carmelites. It was on her 27th birthday, and she took the name of her patroness, Saint Veronica. Sister Veronica has a lifetime before her. This letter came to Newman in the morning. In the evening he started for Paris. His wound began to ache with its first fierceness, and during his long bleak journey the thought of Madame de Cintré's lifetime passed within prison walls on whose outer side he might stand, kept him perpetual company. Now he would fix himself in Paris forever. He would extort a sort of happiness from the knowledge that if she was not there, at least the stony sepulchre that held her was. He descended unannounced upon Mrs. Bread, whom he found keeping lonely watch in his great empty saloons on the Boulevard Haussmann. They were as neat as a Dutch village. Mrs. Bread's only occupation had been removing individual dust particles. She made no complaint, however, of her loneliness, for in her philosophy a servant was but a mysteriously projected machine, and it would be as fantastic for a housekeeper to comment upon a gentleman's absences as for a clock to remark upon not being wound up. No particular clock, Mrs. Bread supposed, went all the time, and no particular servant could enjoy all the sunshine diffused by the career of an exacting master. She ventured, nevertheless, to express a modest hope that Newman meant to remain for a while in Paris. Newman laid his hand on hers and shook it gently. "I mean to remain forever," he said. He went after this to see Mrs. Tristram, to whom he had telegraphed, and who expected him. She looked at him a moment and then shook her head. "This won't do," she said. "You have come back too soon." He sat down and asked about her husband and her children, tried even to inquire about Miss Dora Finch. In the midst of this, "Do you know where she is?" he asked abruptly. Mrs. Tristram hesitated a moment. Of course he couldn't mean Miss Dora Finch. Then she answered properly, "She has gone to the other house, in the Rue d'Enfer." After Newman had sat a while longer, looking very sombre, she went on, "You are not so good a man as I thought. You are more. More what?" Newman asked. "More unforgiving." "Good God!" cried Newman. "Do you expect me to forgive?" "No, not that. I have forgiven, so of course you can't. But you might forget. You have a worse temper about it than I should have expected. You look wicked. You look dangerous." "I may be dangerous," he said, "but I am not wicked. No, I am not wicked." And he got up to go. Mrs. Tristram asked him to come back to dinner, but he answered that he did not feel like pledging himself to be present at an entertainment, even as a solitary guest. Later in the evening, if he should be able, he would come. He walked away through the city, beside the Seine and over it, and took the direction of the Rue d'Enfer. The day had the softness of early spring, but the weather was gray and humid. Newman found himself in a part of Paris which he little knew, a region of convents and prisons, of streets bordered by long dead walls and traversed by a few wayfarers. At the intersection of two of these streets stood the house of the Carmelites, a dull, plain edifice, with a high-shouldered blank wall all around it. From without Newman could see its upper windows, its steep roof and its chimneys. But these things revealed no symptoms of human life. The place looked dumb, deaf, inanimate. The pale, dead, discolored wall stretched beneath it, far down the empty side street, a vista without a human figure. Newman stood there a long time. There were no passers. He was free to gaze his fill. This seemed the goal of his journey. It was what he had come for. It was a strange satisfaction, and yet it was a satisfaction. The barren stillness of the place seemed to be his own release from ineffectual longing. It told him that the woman within was lost beyond recall, and that the days and years of the future would pile themselves above her like the huge immovable slab of a tomb. These days and years in this place would always be just so gray and silent. Suddenly, from the thought of their seeing him stand there, again the charm utterly departed. He would never stand there again. It was gratuitous dreariness. He turned away with a heavy heart, but with a heart lighter than the one he had brought. Everything was over, and he, too, at last could rest. He walked down through narrow winding streets to the edge of the Seine again, and there he saw, close above him, the soft, vast towers of Notre Dame. He crossed one of the bridges and stood a moment in the empty place before the great cathedral. Then he went in beneath the grossly imaged portals. He wandered some distance up the nave and sat down in the splendid dimness. He sat a long time. He heard far away bells chiming off at long intervals to the rest of the world. He was very tired. This was the best place he could be in. He said no prayers. He had no prayers to say. He had nothing to be thankful for, and he had nothing to ask. Nothing to ask, because now he must take care of himself. But a great cathedral offers a very various hospitality, and Newman sat in his place because while he was there he was out of the world. The most unpleasant thing that ever happened to him had reached its formal conclusion, as it were. He could close the book and put it away. He leaned his head for a long time on the chair in front of him. When he took it up he felt that he was himself again. Somewhere in his mind a tight knot seemed to have loosened. He thought of the Bellegardes. He had almost forgotten them. He remembered them as people he had meant to do something to. He gave a groan as he remembered what he had meant to do. He was annoyed at having meant to do it. The bottom, suddenly, had fallen out of his revenge. Whether it was Christian charity or unregenerate good nature, what it was in the background of his soul, I don't pretend to say. But Newman's last thought was that of course he would let the Bellegardes go. If he had spoken it aloud, he would have said that he didn't want to hurt them. He was ashamed of having wanted to hurt them. They had hurt him, but such things were really not his game. At last he got up and came out of the darkening church. not with the elastic step of a man who had won a victory or taken a resolve, but strolling soberly like a good-natured man who was still a little ashamed. Going home, he said to Mrs. Bread that he must trouble her to put back his things into the portmanteau she had unpacked the evening before. His gentle stewardess looked at him through eyes a trifle bedimmed. "Dear me, sir," she exclaimed, "I thought you said you were going to stay forever." "I meant that I was going to stay away forever," said Newman kindly. And since his departure from Paris on the following day, he has certainly not returned. The gilded apartments I have so often spoken of stand ready to receive him, but they serve only as a spacious residence for Mrs. Bread, who wanders eternally from room to room, adjusting the tassels of the curtains, and keeps her wages, which are regularly brought her by a banker's clerk, in a great pink Sèvres vase on the drawing-room mantel-shelf. Late in the evening Newman went to Mrs. Tristram's and found Tom Tristram by the domestic fireside. "I'm glad to see you back in Paris," this gentleman declared. "You know it's really the only place for a white man to live." Mr. Tristram made his friend welcome, according to his own rosy light, and offered him a convenient résumé of the Franco-American gossip of the last 6 months. Then at last he got up and said he would go for half an hour to the club. "I suppose a man who has been for 6 months in California wants a little intellectual conversation. I'll let my wife have a go at you." Newman shook hands heartily with his host, but did not ask him to remain, and then he relapsed into his place on the sofa, opposite to Mrs. Tristram. She presently asked him what he had done after leaving her. "Nothing particular," said Newman. "You struck me," she rejoined, "as a man with a plot in his head. You looked as if you were bent on some sinister errand, and after you had left me I wondered whether I ought to have let you go." "I only went over to the other side of the river, to the Carmelites," said Newman. Mrs. Tristram looked at him a moment and smiled. "What did you do there? Try to scale the wall?" "I did nothing. I looked at the place for a few minutes and then came away." Mrs. Tristram gave him a sympathetic glance. "You didn't happen to meet Monsieur de Bellegarde?" she asked, "staring hopelessly at the convent wall as well? I am told he takes his sister's conduct very hard." "No, I didn't meet him, I am happy to say," Newman answered, after a pause. "They are in the country," Mrs. Tristram went on, "what is the name of the place? Fleurières. They returned there at the time you left Paris, and have been spending the year in extreme seclusion. The little marquise must enjoy it. I expect to hear that she has eloped with her daughter's music master." Newman was looking at the light wood fire, but he listened to this with extreme interest. At last he spoke. "I mean never to mention the name of those people again, and I don't want to hear anything more about them." And then he took out his pocket-book and drew forth a scrap of paper. He looked at it an instant, then got up and stood by the fire. "I am going to burn them up," he said. "I am glad to have you as a witness. There they go." And he tossed the paper into the flame. Mrs. Tristram sat with her embroidery needle suspended. "What is that paper?" she asked. Newman, leaning against the fireplace, stretched his arms and drew a longer breath than usual. Then, after a moment, "I can tell you now," he said. "It was a paper containing a secret of the Bellegardes, something which would damn them if it were known." Mrs. Tristram dropped her embroidery with a reproachful moan. "Ah, why didn't you show it to me?" "I thought of showing it to you. I thought of showing it to everyone. I thought of paying my debt to the Bellegardes that way. So I told them, and I frightened them. They have been staying in the country, as you tell me, to keep out of the explosion. But I have given it up." Mrs. Tristram began to take slow stitches again. "Have you quite given it up?" "Oh, yes." Is it very bad, this secret?" "Yes, very bad." "For myself," said Mrs. Tristram, "I am sorry you have given it up. I should have liked immensely to see your paper. They have wronged me too, you know, as your sponsor and guarantee, and it would have served for my revenge as well. How did you come into possession of your secret?" "It's a long story, but honestly, at any rate." "And they knew you were master of it?" "Oh, I told them." "Dear me, how interesting!" cried Mrs. Tristram. "And you humbled them at your feet?" Newman was silent a moment. "No, not at all. They pretended not to care, not to be afraid. But I know they did care. They were afraid." "Are you very sure?" Newman stared a moment. "Yes, I'm sure." Mrs. Tristram resumed her slow stitches. "They defied you, eh?" "Yes," said Newman, "it was about that." "You tried by the threat of exposure to make them retract?" Mrs. Tristram pursued. "Yes, but they wouldn't. I gave them their choice, and they chose to take their chance of bluffing off the charge and convicting me of fraud. But they were frightened," Newman added, "and I have had all the vengeance I want." "It is most provoking," said Mrs. Tristram, "to hear you talk of the charge when the charge is burnt up. Is it quite consumed?" she asked, glancing at the fire. Newman assured her that there was nothing left of it. "Well, then," she said, "I suppose there is no harm in saying that you probably did not make them so very uncomfortable. My impression would be that since, as you say, they defied you, it was because they believed that, after all, you would never really come to the point. Their confidence, after counsel taken of each other, was not in their innocence, nor in their talent for bluffing things off. It was in your remarkable good nature. You see, they were right." Newman instinctively turned to see if the little paper was in fact consumed, but there was nothing left of it.